You picture Kingston, New Hampshire, in the spring of 1735, a modest farming town of clapboard houses, split-rail fences, mud only just drying from the winter thaw. A man named Mr. Clough butchers a hog that had died of a swollen, sore throat, thinking nothing much of it, the way you might not think much of a sick animal either, not when the meat is needed and the year has been lean. Within days, so local legend tells it, Mr. Clough is dead too, his own throat closing like a fist around a breath he cannot draw. Nobody in Kingston yet understands what has just walked quietly into town, and by the time anyone does, it is already moving from house to house, cradle to cradle, disguised at first as nothing worse than a common cold. Historians still argue whether the sickness that followed was the throat distemper alone, or diphtheria and scarlet fever moving through the town together, indistinguishable to anyone sitting up all night in a darkened sick room. Before the year is out, Kingston has buried roughly 150 children, most of them not yet 10 years old, a number so large it is hard to find a single family in town untouched by it. In nearby Hampton Falls, it goes further still. 20 families lose every single child they have, down to the very last one, and something close to a sixth of the whole town is carried off before the grey choking sickness finally, slowly loosens its grip. So here is the quiet, unsettling question this whole lamplit journey is built around. Why 40? Why does that particular number, of all the numbers historians could have chosen, keep turning up in the old church registers and family Bibles as though it was some kind of finish line that almost nobody in colonial America was truly expected to cross, and what was actually happening underneath it? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop your location and the time on your own clock down in the comments below so that all of us scattered wide across the map tonight can still drift off together in something like the same slow, sleepy company. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on an English quay, and the boards beneath your shoes are slick with fish scale and old rain, the whole harbour smelling of tar, salt, and something faintly rotten underneath it all, the way any busy port smells when too many people and too much cargo pass through in too great a hurry. At your feet sits a wooden chest holding everything you now own in the world, and you try gently not to notice how close its dimensions are to a coffin's, though your mind unhelpfully notices anyway. In your hand is a ticket already damp from your own palm, the ink a little smeared, and quirky as it sounds. The ship's stores of biscuit have already grown their first weevils in the barrel, days before the vessel has even left the dock. You said your goodbyes already, back up the hill where the houses give way to fields, or perhaps you were the sort who slipped off before anyone could turn the leaving into a scene, because scenes, everyone privately agreed, only ever made the leaving harder on both sides. Somewhere behind you a rope thick as your wrist groans taut against a capstan, and a gull wheels low over the water complaining loudly, as though it too has strong opinions about your travel plans and does not think much of them. Sailors move along the rigging above you with the easy, practiced competence of men who have made this crossing many times before, calling to one another in words half swallowed by the wind. The ship herself waits tall and patient at her mooring, sails still furled tight against her yards, her hull the colour of wet oak in the grey morning light, and somewhere below her deck is a space you have not yet seen and cannot yet imagine. 5 feet of headroom and a bunk not much wider than your own shoulders. Other passengers crowd the quay around you, clutching their own chests and bundles, and here and there a family stands in a tight, silent knot, the children too young to understand that the water ahead of them is not a pond or a river, but the beginning of an entirely different life. An agent with a ledger calls out names from his list, checking off each one with a small, satisfied flick of his quill, and you notice that he seems far more cheerful about this whole departure than anyone actually leaving. Somewhere a fiddle is playing, thin and a little off-key, because someone has decided that a send-off, however uncertain its ending, still deserves a tune. The tide is turning. The harbour master keeps saying so, loudly, to no one in particular, and the captain up on the quarterdeck studies the sky the way a farmer studies clouds before haying, reading something in it that you cannot yet read yourself. A light rain has begun to fall, fine as sifted flour, beading on the wool of your cloak and darkening the planks under your feet, and somewhere a merchant is still shouting the price of rope as though today were an ordinary Tuesday, and not the last ordinary day you will know for many weeks. You think, briefly, of the fields behind you, already growing smaller in your mind even before the ship has moved an inch, and of the particular kind of quiet that settles over a person standing at the very edge of one life, not yet inside the next. You climb the gangplank at last, one hand on the rope rail, the wood flexing gently beneath your weight, salt spray catching cold on your face, and somewhere below you the hold receives your chest with a hollow final-sounding thud. The ship waiting now for nothing at all but the tide and your very next step. The ship takes your chest below before it takes you, hauled down through a hatch by a sailor who treats it exactly as gently as he treats the ale casks, and you follow it down a ladder into a world that will be yours for the next 2 months or 3. Nobody aboard is quite sure which. Between decks, the ceiling sits only about 5 feet above the boards, so within the first hour you learn to walk through your own home stooped, like a man permanently checking the floor for something he dropped. You are given a bunk, which turns out to be less a bed than an ongoing argument you will have every night, with the 2 or 3 strangers assigned to share it, over the blanket, over the air, over whose elbow belongs where. Below you the ship creaks in the dark, timbers groaning against every swell, and the only light most nights comes from a single shielded lantern that sways with the ship and throws every shadow into motion right along with it. Seasickness arrives before anything else does, and it takes hold in the same way for everyone aboard, labourers, ministers, wives and children alike, bent over the same rail within the first 2 or 3 days out from harbour. The Atlantic does not particularly care how seasick you are, and for the first week you will wish, sincerely and repeatedly, that it did. The ship rolls, the lantern swings, and the smell below deck slowly becomes a smell you stop noticing, only because your nose mercifully gives up the fight. Historians still argue whether the worst killer on a crossing like this one was the water turning foul in the hold, or the sickness that travelled quietly inside the passengers themselves, carried across an ocean before it ever had the chance to show its face. Ship's biscuit becomes the meal you know best, a hard, flat disc that could, in a pinch, stand in for one of the ship's own timbers, and you learn quickly to knock it against the table before you eat, to persuade whatever is living inside it to leave first. The biscuit itself is baked hard enough on shore to last the entire voyage without spoiling, and weevils travel along with it regardless, small and pale and impossible to entirely pick free from the crumb. Sailors of the age had a trick for this too, of eating the biscuit after dark on the sensible theory that what you cannot see, you cannot mind chewing, and you decide, somewhere around week 4, that you can live with that philosophy. The water is worse than the biscuit. It goes into the cask fresh in an English harbour and does not stay that way, turning green and thick within a few weeks, tasting of the barrel and of something that used to live in the barrel. By the 6th week you are drinking it the way you would drink medicine, fast, through your teeth, without looking at it first, and small beer, on the rare day any is left, becomes the thing men would trade their shoes for. Somewhere around week 6 or 7, if the voyage runs long, scurvy starts to introduce itself quietly. Your gums soften and pull back from your teeth. Old scars you had forgotten about reopen as though your body were keeping better records than you were, and a bone-deep tiredness settles into men who were strong a month before. Joints ache long before anyone can name the cause, and simple wounds that should have closed weeks earlier stay open instead, slow to heal in a body already worn thin by salt meat and biscuit. Nobody aboard has yet connected any of this to fresh food, because that discovery is still generations away, so the sufferers are simply called weak or unlucky, and dosed with whatever remedy the ship's surgeon happens to believe in that particular week. Death, when it comes on a crossing like this, is handled with the same brisk economy as everything else at sea. A canvas shroud, a few words read over the body by whoever aboard knows the right ones, and then the sea receives one more passenger than the ticket accounted for, with no grave and no stone anywhere. The other passengers gather in what room there is to gather in, hats off, and for a few minutes the ship goes quieter than it has been in weeks, before the ordinary business of surviving the crossing simply continues, around the gap that has been left. It happened on real voyages, not just imagined ones. In 1607, of the 144 men and boys who sailed for Virginia, only 104 were still alive to walk ashore at Jamestown, the ocean itself having quietly kept the rest. And still, week after week, you keep climbing to the deck to search the horizon, because that is the only cure anyone aboard has found yet for an ocean this wide. Gulls appear first, wheeling and crying over the water long before any coastline breaks the horizon, and then, faintly, carried out over the waves, the smell of pine and warmed earth reaches the deck before your eyes can confirm any of it. Then, one grey morning, somebody up in the rigging shouts the word every soul below has been waiting for, and the whole ship seems to exhale at once, strangers gripping each other's arms as though they had always been friends, because land has finally shown itself along the edge of the sea, you will forgive yourself later for believing that this was the end of the hard part. It is not. It is barely the middle. The coastline you can see now is only the outer edge of a much longer answer. Capes and shoals with weeks of sailing still folded up inside them before any of it becomes a place you can actually stand. And the relief flooding through the ship this morning, real and warm, turns out to be more than a little premature. The wind that carried you across an entire ocean is no help at all in the narrower water ahead. So sailors climb down into small boats with ropes and haul the ship forward, foot by foot, warping her up a wide brown river that only grows warmer, and thicker with insects, and heavier with August heat, the further inland it carries you. And the moment your boots touch the landing, the heat comes up to meet you like it has been standing there all morning, waiting just for you. This is not English heat. English heat, such as it was, arrived politely and left before supper. Chesapeake heat in August sits on your chest and stays, thick and wet and smelling of mud, of tidal flat exposed at low water, of something green rotting slow in the shallows. The river you have just come up is brown and wide and moves without hurry, and along its banks the marsh grass stands taller than a man, and out of it in the evenings rises a sound you will come to know very well, a thin, high whine that finds your ear in the dark no matter how you turn. They have a word here for what happens to you next, and it is such a mild word that you might mistake it for something a cook does to a stew. Seasoning. You are, they tell you, about to be seasoned, as though the climate were simply going to work a little flavour into you, round off your English edges and set you down the better for it. Nobody explains it further than that on the dock, and there is a reason for that. And the reason is that explaining it further would ruin the welcome. Better to let a newcomer settle in first, unpack the chest, admire the strange wide sky, before mentioning what the word is quietly standing in for. What seasoning actually means is this. Somewhere around the third week the fever finds you. It does not announce itself as anything unusual. A heaviness in the limbs first, a headache behind the eyes, a loss of appetite you put down to the strange food and the standing water, and then, one evening, the shivering starts. Not a little shiver, a shiver that comes up from somewhere below your knees and takes over your whole body, so that your teeth go and the blankets do nothing, and you lie there rattling in the heat of a Virginia summer night, which is a strange enough thing to have happened to you that you might laugh about it later, if there is a later. The shivering breaks, eventually into its opposite. A burning so total that the same blankets you begged for an hour ago now feel like a punishment, and you throw them off, and you sweat clean through what is left of your good English linen, and somewhere in that furnace you start to understand why they call it seasoning and not say dying, which would be more accurate and much less good for recruitment. The odds, once you're standing in them, are not the kind of thing anyone puts on a broadside advertising cheap land across the water. A white man in this colony who lives to see 20 stands a genuinely decent chance of reaching his 40s, sometimes his late 40s, and that part at least is not exaggeration. But getting to 20 is the trick. The whole trick, the one nobody prints on the recruitment bill. Something like a quarter of the children born here die in infancy, and another quarter never make it out of their teens, and the summer you're living through right now, this exact overheated, mosquito-thick August, is precisely the sort of summer that trims those numbers down further still. Historians still argue whether seasoning was really one single disease wearing different faces, or a whole cluster of them arriving together. Malaria, certainly. But tangled up with dysentery and whatever else the water and the crowding and the long exhaustion of the crossing had already loosened in you, and honestly, lying in a strange bed shaking, you are not inclined to award anyone a monopoly on the credit. You are tended, when you are tended at all, by strangers. Not unkindly, a woman you have never met wrings out a cloth and lays it on your forehead. Someone brings you small beer because plain water is, correctly, trusted less than it probably should be, but strangers all the same, in a room that is not yours, in a colony that was not yours a month ago and does not feel any more like yours now. There is a particular quiet loneliness to being sick far from anyone who has known you longer than a season, and nobody on that dock mentioned that part either, back when the talk was all of tobacco and land and a fresh start. Here is the quirky part, the part that sounds almost like a joke told at your own expense. The very word itself was borrowed straight from the seasoning of timber. Wood left to dry and toughen slowly before it could be trusted to bear any real weight, and somebody along the way decided this was also an apt description for what a malarial river does to a human body, which tells you rather a lot about who was doing the naming and how little tenderness went into it. If you survive, and it is a genuine if, phrased that plainly by the people around you, who have buried enough newcomers by now to have stopped pretending otherwise, You will be called seasoned from then on, and that word will follow you for the rest of your life here like a small, hard-won title. A seasoned man is worth more on paper, trusted with more, married more readily, given more responsibility on the plantation, because a seasoned man has already paid a toll that kills so many others before they ever finish paying it. It is, in its own way, the only advancement this climate grants, earned only by surviving the very thing meant to take you down in the first place. Right now, though, none of that has been decided yet. Right now, you are only aware of the fever loosening its grip for the first time in what feels like days uncounted, the burning easing at last into something almost bearable, your shirt soaked clean through and slowly cooling against you in the thick, unmoving air, and somewhere close by, patient and ordinary and entirely unconcerned with anything you have just survived, sits the water barrel. You look at the water barrel the way you might look at an old friend who has just been revealed as a double agent, because as it turns out, the river that fed this settlement was never entirely on your side. Back in 1607, when 144 English men and boys sailed for this same tidal neck of land, 104 of them lived long enough to step ashore and start building. Within a year, only about 38 were left to tell the newcomers how it had gone, which is not a story anyone tells cheerfully, and not a story anyone told loudly either. Jamestown's early letters home have a certain diplomatic vagueness about them, the way a person writing to worried parents tends to leave out the worst paragraphs. Here is the part nobody puts on the recruiting poster. The James River is tidal, which means it breathes in and out with the moon, and every summer the salt water pushes further upstream than it should, right past the spot where the town had, with the confidence of people who had never done this before, decided to draw its drinking water. The waste of a few hundred people went into that same stretch of river. The salt tide held it there instead of flushing it out to sea, stirring it gently, patiently, back toward every bucket and every cup. You were, in the most literal sense available to 17th century biology, drinking the town's own sewage, sweetened with a little brine, and calling it supper. Typhoid did not knock politely. Neither did dysentery. The two of them moved through Jamestown in recurring waves, and when one arrived it could take 30% of the settlement, or more in a single pass, which is the sort of number that is almost too tidy to be believable until you remember that tidy numbers are just what grief looks like once someone has had time to count it. You survive one wave and privately congratulate yourself, the way a person does after successfully getting out of bed on a difficult morning, and then the water goes green again the following July and the whole business starts over. And then there was the winter that gets its own name because ordinary language wasn't going to cover it. The winter of 1609 into 1610, remembered ever after as the starving time, began with something like 500 people sheltering inside the fort and ended by spring with something closer to 60. You do not need the particulars of what got a colonist through those months. History has recorded a few of them, and they are not for a bedtime story. And honestly, they were not for anyone. Not really. Not even the people who lived them. What matters here, spoken gently, is the arithmetic. 500 souls became 60 souls in one dark season, penned inside a wooden palisade with a river on one, side and starvation on the other, and if that number sits heavy in your chest for a moment, let it, and then let it go, because you are not there. You're only remembering it on their behalf, which is its own kind of duty. Historians still argue whether the worst of early Virginia's dying should be blamed mainly on that poisoned water supply, or mainly on malaria. Ferried in quietly aboard the same ships that brought the settlers, waiting in every patch of standing water for a mosquito to do its work. The honest answer is probably both, arm in arm, taking turns, because 17th century Virginia was not the kind of place that limited itself to a single way of killing you, and its outbreaks rarely bothered to fill out the paperwork, explaining which culprit deserved the credit. Zoom out, and the ledger for those years reads almost sideways. Of roughly every 6 people who crossed the ocean for Virginia, between 1607 and 1624, only about 1 lived to tell anybody about it in person, over a tankard, with the story getting a little better each time it was retold. Those are not odds you would take on a coin toss, and yet thousands took them anyway, because the alternative back home, a life with no land, no prospects, and no chance of ever owning either, looked to a hungry young man in an English port town like the more certain kind of dying. Funny, in the driest possible sense, how often the safe choice and the desperate gamble turn out to be the very same ship. Here is the quiet, strange little fact tucked inside all of this. The settlers kept planting mulberry trees along the riverbank in these same years, under royal instruction, in hopes of starting an English silk industry to rival anything from the Orient. Apparently unbothered that half of them wouldn't live to see the trees mature, let alone spin a single thread from them. Ambition, it turns out, does not wait politely for survival to be settled first. Slide forward 100 years, and the river has not changed its habits even slightly. The tide still climbs the James every summer. The water still turns brackish and unkind in the same weeks it always has, and a mosquito still finds a wrist to land on, with the same unhurried confidence its great-great-grandmother had. The town around the water has grown quieter, better fed, better built, its palisades replaced by fences, its terror dulled into a kind of grim household routine, but the river itself has made no such peace with anybody. It is simply patient the way rivers are, waiting out every generation that thinks it has finally figured out how to live beside it. And in a warm upstairs room not far from that same water, with the shutters drawn against the evening air, a very different kind of waiting is about. To begin, one with neighbour women gathered close, a fire banked low, and a birth about to happen the way every birth in this century happens, without any guarantee at all. And it is toward one lit window, 100 years further up this same river valley, that the story now turns, because before any of this, the fevers, the ledgers, the long arithmetic of who reaches 40, you first have to arrive, and arriving turns out to be a crossing too, made not by you but through you, on a night when someone else does all the travelling on your behalf. You are the one being born tonight, though you will carry no memory of any of it, so let it be told to you gently, from just outside, the way it looked to everyone standing in the room. A boy has already been sent running into the dark, lantern swinging, breath clouding in the cold, knocking on doors that open one after another, as neighbour women dress by feel and follow him out into the night. Because a birth here is never a private matter. It is a small community assembling itself, half dressed and half awake, around one bed. By the time they arrive, the room has been shut tight against the night air, shutters latched, every crack stuffed with rag, the fire built up so high it sweats the walls, because bad air was thought to slip in through any gap it could find, and nobody was taking chances, with something they could not even see coming. Your father, meanwhile, is not officially classified as bad air, but he is asked to wait downstairs regardless, and he goes, gratefully, the way most men in this story go whenever a room fills with capable women and closes its door. Someone has set a pot of caudle warming on the crane, wine or ale thickened with egg yolk, sugar and warm spice, and it goes round the room from hand to hand, like a slow toast nobody says aloud, poured for the labouring mother, and for the women keeping her company both, because a long night calls for fortification, and nobody in this century, it seems, has yet invented a version of hospitality that does not begin with a hot drink pressed into your hands. At the centre of it all sits a low, crescent-shaped birthing stool, its wood worn smooth by every mother who has gripped its arms before this one, notched so a woman can be held upright, and let plain gravity do work no manual has ever needed to explain. Around it, the neighbour women take their turns at her back and her hands, murmuring, timing, wiping her brow, remembering their own nights like this one out loud, in low voices, as though the memory itself were useful medicine. And presiding over the entire room, answerable to no one in it, is the midwife, whose word here outranks minister, husband, and any physician unwise enough to have been summoned, because childbirth, of all things, is one of the very few rooms in this world run entirely by women, on their own authority, by their own hard-won knowledge. If you are fortunate enough to be born within reach of Hallowell, Maine, sometime after 1778, the woman kneeling at that stool might well be Martha Moore Ballard, who delivered babies in this corner of New England for decades, and wrote down nearly every night of it afterward, close to 10,000 diary entries across 27 years, most of them a few plain lines about weather, chores, and whoever she had just helped into the world. Between 1778 and 1812, she recorded 996 deliveries and lost 4 mothers, a record so much better than the male physicians working around her that it would eventually embarrass an entire profession, though it took 2 centuries for anyone to notice. She grew her own herbs in her own garden, gathered roots and bark from the woods around her house, mixed her own remedies from them by hand, and never once bled a patient, which, given how enthusiastically colonial medicine bled patients for nearly everything else, may have been the single wisest decision available to anyone practicing on this continent at the time. Historians still argue whether New England's long, stubborn lifespan came down to its cold winters, its cleaner water, its whole family migration, or simply its better record-keeping, and Martha Ballard's diary sits right in the middle of that argument, because a woman this careful with a quill may also have been this careful with everything else in her care. 2 centuries later, those same plain little entries about weather, chores and safe deliveries became the spine of a Pulitzer-winning book, a strange kind of immortality for a woman who never once imagined she was writing for anyone but herself. None of that carefulness, though, could reach the danger waiting on the other side of delivery. A mother could come through the birth itself, through the stool and the caudal and the long watching night, seemingly whole and glad and tired, and then fall ill days afterward, with a fever that climbed and would not break, childbed fever, the great quiet killer of the lying-in room, and there was no way for anyone present, midwife or physician alike, to have seen it coming. Germ theory sat a full century over the horizon still, and nobody in that shuttered, overwarm room had the faintest notion that hands themselves, however clean they looked, could carry harm invisibly from one bed to the next. So the fever, when it came, looked exactly like bad luck, or bad air, or the plain will of God, because those were the only explanations anyone in the room actually owned. But tonight is not that night. Tonight the fire holds, the caudal is passed once more in relief rather than worry, and the midwife wraps you, weighs you in her 2 hands, checks you over by candlelight, and carries you across the room to the waiting arms that have been aching for you since long before you existed. Outside the shutters, the dark goes on being dark, indifferent to all of it, while inside, warm and close and smelling of wood smoke and spiced wine, the newborn is carried the short walk to the hearth and laid down in a cradle still warm from the fire, close enough to hear it breathing, low and small, through the rest of the night. The fire holds its warmth long after the midwife has climbed into her own bed at last, and the small weight beside it in the wicker cradle is, for tonight, only breathing, which is its own small miracle, because here in the Chesapeake in this century, roughly a quarter of the children born into rooms like this one will not see a first birthday, and another quarter, having somehow cleared that first hurdle, will still not live to see 20. You do not know these numbers as numbers. You know them as the aunt who never married, the empty half of a shared name, the small stone leaning at the edge of the burying ground. You wrap the child now, tight, arms pinned to its sides, legs bound straight as a fence rail, winding the linen strip, round and round in the firelight until the whole small body is a neat warm parcel smelling of wool and tallow smoke. This is what the neighbour women taught you, and what their mothers taught them, that a newborn's bones are soft as green wood, and that without the bands to guide them the limbs will bow, the spine will curve, the whole small body will grow up crooked instead of straight. It is a tidy theory. It is also, if you are the sort of person who notices such things, remarkably convenient for whoever first thought of it, since a swaddled infant is also a quiet, portable, one-handed sort of infant, easily hung on a peg like a coat while you get the bread in. Whether the binding does much for the bones is its own question. It plainly does wonders for the exhausted adults doing the carrying. If your own milk does not come, or comes thin, or you are a woman of means with other duties pulling at you, there is the wet nurse. Another woman, often one who has just lost her own child or weaned one early, offering her breast to yours for wages, or for keep, or simply for favour between neighbours. Nobody thinks this strange, because a baby fed is a baby fed whoever the milk belongs to. She may stay in your household for months, sleeping near the cradle, her own grief folded quietly under the daily business of a stranger's child at her breast. The 2 griefs, hers and the one you do not yet have, sitting side by side in the same small room without either woman naming it aloud. You watch her rock the baby against a body that is not its mother's, and understand this as ordinary mercy, one of the small, unspoken arrangements colonial households run on without needing a name for it beyond simple necessity. Weaning comes hard, usually in the warm months. Once the milk teeth are in and the child is moved on to pap and gruel, bread softened in broth or milk, whatever soft-spooned thing the household already eats. This is exactly when the danger turns sharpest, because summer is also when flies breed thick and black around the privy. Milk turns sour in an afternoon on the shelf, and water sits warm and green in the barrel by the door. The weaned infant, no longer shielded by its mother's milk, meets that contaminated food and water directly, and diarrhea sweeps through nurseries with such terrible clockwork regularity that people simply call it the summer complaint, as though it were a passing mood rather than a disease that can empty a cradle in a week. You learn to watch the season turn the way you watch a darkening sky, with the same low, private dread. And when a child does not survive, when the cradle empties before its first year turns, you do, in time, another thing that would strike a later century as strange and struck this one as ordinary comfort. You give the next baby the name of the one you lost. Another Mary, if Mary died. Another John, laid in the very crib where the first John once lay, called by the same name at the same hearth, answering soon enough to a name that already belonged to someone else in the family Bible, as though the name itself were a small inheritance too precious to bury twice. Whole family registers carry 2 or 3 children answering to one name born years apart, and a clerk copying baptismal entries a century later, squinting at faded ink by a window, might be forgiven for wondering briefly whether some remarkably persistent child had simply refused to stay dead. But even that clerk is only working from what made it onto the page, and a great deal never did. A child who dies before baptism, in the first hours or the first days, sometimes before a minister can be fetched at all through mud or snow or a river running high, often never enters the parish register in any form, neither born nor buried, no line of ink, no small stone, a whole life passing entirely outside the paperwork of its own century. Historians still argue whether recorded infant mortality is badly undercounted for exactly this reason, since it means the quarter you started with tonight is very likely a flaw and not a true count, and that every number anyone quotes to you tonight and every night after is quietly missing some fraction of the smallest and briefest lives it claims to hold. None of this occupies the household going about its evening. There is milk to warm, linen to change, a cradle to rock with one foot while your hands stay busy with something else. Entirely on and on, week folding into week, the fire banked low and built up again each morning, the child growing heavier in your arms, steadier in the neck, filling out the gown that once hung loose on it. And then one evening the legs that were once bound so carefully straight in their swaddling bands are planted wide on the floorboards instead, bare and wobbling, testing their own new weight, one small hand gripping the edge of a stool, and then, without quite deciding to, letting go. And now that child is walking, is talking, is a name you call across a dooryard rather than a bundle you count breaths for, and the years ahead are stacked with fevers that arrive dressed up in almost friendly names, measles and whooping cough and scarlet fever, each one a season you simply have to get your household through, the way you get through a hard winter or a wet harvest. Measles comes in waves through a town, one household lighting up after another, a rash creeping down from the hairline while the child burns and coughs and squints at the window light, the room kept dim and close and smelling of tallow and warm wool. Whooping cough settles in for weeks, a bark that ends in a long indrawn whoop you can hear through a shut door, wearing a small body down meal by meal, breath by breath, night after broken night. Scarlet fever paints its own rash, sandpaper rough under your fingers, and a tongue gone strawberry red, and sometimes it passes through like weather, and sometimes it does not pass at all. You nurse what you can nurse with what you have, small beer to keep something in a dry mouth, a poultice, a prayer, the particular quiet of a house where every footstep is softened on purpose and every door is opened slowly. But it is the throat distemper you have learned to dread above all the rest, because you have seen what it does, and because it came back and back again, across the years from 1735 to 1741, moving parish to parish through New England like a slow grey tide nobody could chart or stop. It starts almost nothing, a scratch in the throat, a child who says they feel poorly the way children always say they feel poorly, a little warm to the touch, off their supper, restless under the blanket. You have sat in that chair beside that bed before, on nights that turned out to be nothing, and some part of you wants this to be one of those nights too. Then the fever climbs and will not come back down, and the appetite goes entirely, and somewhere in the second or third day, a grey membrane begins to grow across the back of the throat, tough and pale as old wax, closing a passage that was never very wide to begin with. You sit with a candle and a cup of something warm you cannot get them to swallow, and you listen to a breath narrowing hour by hour, and there is nothing in the apothecary's jars or the minister's prayers that reaches in and clears that throat. That is the whole terrible arithmetic of it, and it is arithmetic whole towns were made to do, quietly, one household at a time. Kingston, New Hampshire, you already know, the first town it found in the spring of 1735, and the roughly 150 children it took there before it moved on. What you may not have carried with you is what happened after Kingston, because the distemper did not stop at one town's border. It walked the roads the way news walked the roads, parish to parish through Hampton Falls, where it took about a sixth of the entire population and left 20 families in that one small town with no living children at all. Not one fewer, not most, all. And then on, through the years, town after town, until by 1741 the reckoning across New England came to something near 5,000 dead. More than 3 in 4 of them were children, and the overwhelming majority of all of them Children and otherwise had not yet reached 20 years of age. Sit with that shape for a moment. Not a single terrible spring in one village, but 6 years of springs, 6 years of the same grey membrane finding new towns, new bedrooms, new chairs pulled up beside new beds. A town clerk somewhere is entering names into a register faster than he ever expected to, and running short of room in the margin, and a minister somewhere is choosing for the third time in a fortnight a text for a funeral sermon far too small for the coffin it accompanies. Historians still argue whether the throat distemper of 1735 was diphtheria alone, or diphtheria and scarlet fever moving together, tangled into one epidemic that colonial doctors, working with no microscope and no name for a germ, could only ever describe by what they saw, which was a membrane, a fever, and far too many small coffins going out through far too many front doors. There is a kind of mercy, if you can call it that, in how earnestly the almanacs of the day tried to help, pages of advice on gargles and possets, and the letting of blood, written with total confidence and precisely no understanding of what they were up against, which is its own quiet, sad little joke on how far medicine still had to travel before it caught up with its own certainty. And there is a smaller joke, gentler still, in the sheer poetry. Colonial tongues reached for when naming what frightened them. The throat distemper, the putrid sore throat, names that sound like something a worried aunt might call an ordinary head cold, hung instead on a disease that could empty a nursery in a season. Even the schoolmaster, ordinarily the grandest authority in any small town, a man who ruled his hickory-floored room with a birch switch and a look that could quiet 40 children at once, found himself outranked entirely by a fever that no amount of switching could send back to its seat. What is left after a run of years like that is quiet in places that used to be loud. You walk past the schoolhouse on an ordinary morning, past the split-rail fence and the trodden path worn by feet that used to hurry, past the woodpile stacked for a winter of lessons, and the door stands open the way it always has, and inside the benches that once sat 2 and 3 children shoulder to shoulder now sit half empty. The wood worn smooth in places nobody sits anymore, and yet the fire at home has never gone quiet like that. Not once. Not in your whole life. Not since somebody first knelt at that hearth with flint and steel and coaxed. A spark into a flame that has simply been fed, banked, and woken again every day since. It is the centre of the house in every sense that matters. The one warm bright point in a cold dim room. The place you cook, the place you dry your stockings, the place the cat sleeps and the cradle sits, and the old dog dozes close enough to the flame to singe his own fur. You have never lived a day without it crackling somewhere nearby, and you have never trusted a house that keeps its fire shut away in a separate room, as if warmth were something visited rather than simply lived inside of, which is also, if you are honest, the trouble with the whole arrangement. Your skirts are long, your petticoats trail, and the hem of a working dress brushes ash and embers 100 times a day, without incident right up until the day it does not. A gust down the chimney, a log settling wrong, a moment's inattention while you reach for the crane that swings the kettle over, the flame, and wool can smoulder before you smell it, and linen can catch faster than you can turn around. Every woman here has a story about a scorched hem, a singed eyebrow, a burn across the wrist from a kettle that tipped, and most stories end with nothing worse than a scar and a lesson learned the hard way. Not all of them do. A burn, a real one, is a far graver order of trouble than it will be for your great-great-grandchildren, who will have salves and dressings and later medicines against the rot a burn invites in behind it. You have none of that waiting for you. Germ theory has not been discovered yet, so nobody here can tell you why a wound left too long turns hot and foul rather than simply healing, only that it sometimes does, and that once it does there is little anyone can do but keep it clean, wrap it in linen and hope. A small burn is a nuisance shrugged off by supper, a serious one, on a child, on a hand that cannot simply be kept still while the rest of the farm waits on nobody, can be the quiet beginning of the end. Weeks later, from an infection nobody in the room has a proper word for. And the hearth is only the opening line of an ordinary day's arithmetic. There is the well out back, deep and dark and uncovered, because covering it properly is one more chore nobody gets around to, and there is the pond past the fence line where the ducks go, and if your town has a mill race, there is a channel of moving water with a current far stronger than it looks, cutting close enough to the path that everyone's grandmother has a story about somebody's child. Children mind children here, because there is always a baby and never enough spare adults, and a 7-year-old set to watch a toddler while supper gets made is doing exactly what every family in this colony asks of its 7-year-olds. Most afternoons, nothing happens. Some afternoons, a small distraction near a well curb or a creek bank is all it takes, and the water gives no warning first. It is not only water and fire either. The hayloft ladder is missing a rung nobody has fixed. The barn roof needs mending and somebody's son is up there anyway, because the roof will not mend itself, and there is nobody to spare for waiting. The horse that has carried you gently for 6 years can still, on one particular Tuesday, startle at nothing you will ever identify, and put you on the ground harder than any horse has before. None of this feels like danger while it is happening. It feels like Tuesday, plainly because it is Tuesday, and a Tuesday here asks more of your balance, your footing, and your ordinary luck than it will ever ask of people 200 years from now, who will find it strange a household could lose someone to a bucket and a slippery bank. Historians still argue whether burning truly was, as the old story so often insists, the single leading cause of death for colonial women once they were past their childbearing years, or whether that particular claim has simply been repeated so many times it hardened into fact without ever quite earning it. What is not in dispute is that the hearth killed people, steadily, unglamorously, in ones and twos across every township you could name, in a way that never once made it into a Sunday sermon the way plague or fever did, because there is no convenient devil to blame for a kettle that tips. There is, if it is any comfort, a dry little joke buried in how neatly the danger clusters around the exact chores nobody's allowed to skip. Nobody drowns avoiding water. Nobody burns avoiding fire. You cannot excuse yourself from cooking, from drawing water, or from climbing up to fix a roof on the grounds that these chores have occasionally proven fatal to your neighbours, which is either the bravest or the most resigned arrangement any civilization has agreed to without a single vote taken. And here is the small odd tidbit worth carrying to bed tonight, because striking a brand new fire from cold flint and steel is such slow, knuckle-bruising work. Most households would rather send a child next door to borrow a shovelful of live coals from a neighbour's hearth than start one from nothing themselves, which means that on any evening half the fires burning across a village can trace their flame back to one shared spark. So tonight, as on every other night before anyone climbs up to the loft or into the low back room to sleep, someone in the house does the last chore of the day, the quiet one, raking the coals into a low bed at the back of the hearth, covering them gently over with a soft grey drift of ash to hold their heat without their flame, banking the fire down to something small and patient and safe enough to leave. And when the last log is banked, and the embers are drawn close under their blanket of ash, you turn from the hearth toward the shelf by the door, where the morning's first task is already waiting for you in a stoneware jug. You will not drink water first, not if you can help it. You will drink small beer, thin, faintly sour, brewed low enough in strength that a child of 6 can have a mug of it with her bread, and nobody in the room so much as blinks. Breakfast, dinner, supper, small beer or cider moves through your household the way water moves through a modern one. So ordinary that nobody remarks on it, so constant that your children grow up never having tasted a single day without it. You would find this strange, if you had anything else to compare it to. You don't. Cider is the other constant, and it arrives every year with the whole smell of autumn baked into it. The orchard behind the house dropping its fruit in heavy, bruised handfuls through September, the family turning out with baskets to gather what the wasps have not claimed first, and then the slow, grinding creak of the press squeezing out a thin gold. Stream into waiting tubs. You drink it new and sweet for a few days, and then, as the barrels down in the cellar work and turn through the winter, you drink it sharper, until by the coldest months it has become something close to vinegar with ambitions. Nobody minds especially. It still tastes better than the alternative, and unlike water left standing in a warm cask, it keeps. Rum arrives differently, not grown in your own dooryard, but carried up from the West Indies in the bellies of ships. Sugar and molasses turned into something that will knock the chill out of a body faster than any amount of wool. It is stronger than small beer, stronger than cider, and treated accordingly. A dram here, a tot there, a comfort for a bad tooth or a hard winter. Never quite the all-day drink that beer and cider are. Still, it sits on the shelf of most households that can afford it. A small imported miracle that began as cane in a hot foreign field and ended as warmth in a cold northern throat. Here is the part nobody around you understands, and the part that is quietly saving your life anyway. The boiling that goes into brewing beer, and the fermentation that turns apple juice into cider, are killing off exactly the things in the water that would otherwise be killing you. Nobody in this century has looked closely enough to see why. You would think the theory ought to come before the habit. Instead, the habit came first, hammered out over generations of grim trial and error, and the theory, the notion of germs too small to see, will not arrive for another 100 years yet. Until then, there is only a stubborn, well-earned suspicion that raw water from the wrong place makes a household sick, and that boiled or brewed drink somehow does not. Not all water is equally dangerous, and this is where luck matters more than wisdom. A spring bubbling up from stone on a hillside, water running fast over clean gravel, rain caught off a roof into a barrel. These can be perfectly fine, and plenty of households drink nothing else their whole lives without harm. But dig your well too close to your own privy, on ground that slopes the wrong way, and you have built yourself a slow poison and called it a convenience. Nobody surveys the ground first. Nobody tests anything. You choose a spot because it sits close to the kitchen door, and the soil underneath makes the real decision for you, quietly, over years, in ways nobody digging the well could have predicted or prevented, even if they had wanted to. This is, more or less, what happened at Jamestown a century back, on a grander and far crueler scale. The fort built where the river ran deep enough for ships, which also happened to be exactly where the tide pushed brackish, waste-fouled water back up past the settlement each summer, so that the men drinking from the river were drinking in no small part themselves, and typhoid or dysentery could tear through the town and kill 30% of it in a single stroke. Historians still argue whether the Chesapeake's brutal mortality in those early decades was mainly the water or mainly the malaria that arrived with the ships and the standing water beside every house. The two miseries working together so closely that separating blame between them is nearly impossible. Now, what is not in dispute is that safe water, here on your own patch of ground, is a matter of slope and luck far more than it is a matter of anyone's knowledge, and the households whose well sat high and sandy and far from anything foul were simply, unknowingly, fortunate. So you drink your beer at breakfast and your cider at dinner, and you save the rum for when the cold turns serious, and you do all of it without one clear idea of why it keeps you alive rather than the water would. You only know in your bones, the way a body knows a truth it cannot yet explain, that this is somehow safer. If there is a quirky comfort in any of it, it is this. An entire civilization stayed reasonably healthy for generations on a policy of mild, all-day drinking that nobody intended as medicine, and everybody would have described, if asked, as simply supper, simply how a household gets through its own day. You take the candle now and go down the narrow cellar stairs, past the shelf where next spring seed corn waits in its sack, down into air that turns cool and damp and smells of must and old apples, where the barrels sit in rows in the cold and the dark, breathing faintly through their bungs, turning apples and grain slowly into the one drink in the house nobody has to be afraid of. Beside those barrels of cider sit others, shorter and heavier, packed with grey crystal salt and cuts of pork pressed down under the brine. And this is where your winter actually lives, right here in this cold, reeking dark. You will eat from this barrel, more or less, until spring, and you will eat corn beside it at nearly every sitting, because corn is what this land gives back most willingly, and the people already living here taught the newcomers how to grow it, mounding the earth and burying a fish beside each seed to feed the soil. You boil it whole into samp, you soak it in wood ash lye until the hard hull slips free and call what is left hominy, a trick borrowed from native cooking that also, though nobody here could have told you why, unlocks nourishment. Plain boiled corn keeps locked inside itself. You stir cornmeal into boiling water or milk until it thickens into hasty pudding, eaten hot with whatever sweetness the house can spare. You slap cornmeal dough onto a griddle, or, tradition insists, onto the flat of a hoe held over the coals, and call the result a Johnny cake, a name that sounds like marketing, dressed up as history, which in its way it is. Each dish has its own texture in the mouth and its own smell in the room. Samp thick and grainy, hominy soft, and faintly sweet once the lye is rinsed away. Hasty pudding steaming and smooth enough to slide straight from spoon to throat on a night too cold to chew much of anything. If you are newly arrived from England, corn takes some getting used to. Wheat bread is a luxury here, flour dear and often scarce, so corn fills the gap. At breakfast, dinner and supper, in a rotation so faithful you start to suspect the cook has taken a private vow. You're not wrong to notice the sameness. Ask any 3 newcomers what they miss most from home, and at least 2 will say bread. Real bread, the kind that does not crumble to yellow dust in your hand. But corn keeps you alive, it grows where wheat struggles, and within a generation or 2 it stops feeling foreign at all. The salt pork in that barrel, and whatever beef, fish or fowl your household manages to preserve alongside it, is what carries you through the months when nothing green is growing. You salt it. You smoke it in the chimney's slow, cool draft until it takes on a deep amber sheen and a smell that clings to the rafters for weeks. You dry it on racks until it goes stiff and dark as old leather, and you pickle vegetables in vinegar and brine until the cellar shelves are lined with crocks of cucumbers and cabbage gone sharp and keeping. Fresh greens are a summer memory by January. A garden that overflowed in August is reduced by midwinter to root vegetables in a sand-packed bin, and even those dwindle. This is where the calendar turns cruel. Late spring is what households quietly call the hungry gap, that stretch when last year's stores are thin or finished, the salt meat down to rind and bone, and this year's garden has barely broken the soil. Bellies do a kind of arithmetic they do not enjoy. It is in this gap, after months without anything fresh, that scurvy can creep into a household that survived the whole hard winter, only to falter in April, gums going soft and tender in the very season that should feel like relief. In the Chesapeake, where only one crossing in 6 between 1607 and 1624 lived to grow old at all, a thin, hungry spring was rarely the thing written down as the cause of death. Yet it was there, quietly, behind a great many of the fevers that finished the job. Historians still argue whether colonial diets were in fact healthier, on the whole, than the diets of the ordinary English people left behind. Meat here is more plentiful than in most English cottages. A labourer's family in Devon might see fresh meat rarely, while yours might have salt pork most days, however monotonous it becomes by February. Grain is often more abundant too, corn yielding heavily, where English wheat would struggle on thin colonial. Soil and a colonial table, plain as it looks, often carries more on it by weight than an English cottager's ever did. And yet the seasonal gap is real, the winter deficiency is real, and a diet heavy in salted, smoked and preserved food, however filling, is not the same as a varied one. Both things can be true at once, which is, admittedly, an unsatisfying kind of answer to fall asleep on. Small comforts persist. Milk, when a household keeps a cow, softens the corn and the winter both. Maple sugar, boiled down in early spring from trees you have known your whole life, sweetens what little there is to sweeten. Fish, salted or fresh depending on the season and your distance from water, breaks up the endless pork, and there is a quiet irony. In it, the newcomers who once turned up their noses at corn as fit only for livestock came within a few winters to depend on it entirely, to plant it faithfully and to defend it, mildly but firmly, whenever a fresh arrival from England called it poor food. You learn, as everyone here learns, to watch the calendar as closely as you watch the sky, because the difference between a well-fed household and a hungry one is rarely a single bad harvest. It is the narrow waiting weeks at the very end of winter, when the barrels are scraped down to their staves and the frost has not yet loosened its grip on the ground, and along the front path low against the fence, the dooryard garden is just beginning to stir, the first pale curls of green pushing up through soil still cold from the last hard frost. Too early yet to eat, too early yet to trust, but they're all the same. Beyond the dooryard garden, past the first ruffled leaves of lettuce nosing up through the cold dirt, sits a jar you have grown fonder of than you probably should. Pale brown sugar shipped up from the West Indies, cheaper and more plentiful with each passing decade of your life, and it is doing something to your mouth that no one around you has the first notion how to name. You feel it before you understand it, a low ache behind a back tooth on a cold morning, a twinge when the tea runs too hot or the cider too cold, a small persistent ache setting up residence in your jaw. Decay creeps in soft and patient, dissolving the hard white armour of the tooth from the outside in, and once it reaches the living pulp beneath, the ache stops being occasional and becomes a tenant who will not leave. An abscess is worse than an ache. It is infection pooling at the root, swelling the jaw, sometimes the whole side of the face until you cannot chew, cannot sleep on that side, cannot think of much else. You press a warm cloth to it and you wait, because waiting is most of what home. Remedy has to offer a bad tooth, and you try, gently, not to imagine what is happening under your own skin. Sugar did not invent the toothache, but it certainly gave it a career. Cheap West Indian sugar, hauled north on the same ships that carried rum and molasses, sweetened tea and pastry and preserved fruit for households that could never have afforded it a century before, and colonial mouths, unaccustomed to so much of it, and unequipped with anything resembling a toothbrush, paid the bill in cavities. Historians still argue whether colonial diets were healthier than contemporary English ones, and a good deal of that argument comes down to exactly this. a diet of corn and cider and salt meat balanced uneasily against a growing taste. For sugar the English poor could rarely afford. When the ache finally wins, you do not go to a dentist because there mostly isn't one, not as you would picture it. You go instead to the barber surgeon, the same tradesman who cuts your hair and lets your blood, pulling teeth having quietly become part of the same trade. The theory apparently being that anyone comfortable with a razor near your throat can be trusted near your jaw. His striped pole, red and white, is a leftover sign of bloodletting rather than barbering, a small quirk of the trade that has outlived its own explanation. He carries a tool called a tooth key, shaped rather like a door key, which clamps around the offending tooth, and with a firm, practiced twist of the wrist, the tooth comes free, roots and all, if you are fortunate, in pieces if you are not. There is no numbing draught worth the name, only a steadying hand on your shoulder, a fast decision, and the real, immediate relief afterward of the ache finally stopping. You are, at least, allowed to keep the tooth itself for whatever comfort that offers. It is worth understanding why a bad tooth mattered so much more than it does now. An infection in the jaw has a direct road into the rest of the body, and in a world without antibiotics, a road infection sometimes takes. What starts as a swollen cheek can spread into the neck, into the bloodstream, into the kind of fever that carries off strong young people for reasons no one at the bedside can explain. A toothache here is not merely an inconvenience. It is one more small door that infection knows how to open, and you have learned to take it seriously long before it becomes unbearable. And your mouth is only the beginning of the inventory. Your eyes, if you are the sort who reads or sews by firelight, go soft at the edges by your 30s, the world blurring at its corners, and spectacles, where they exist at all, are a luxury owned by the wealthy, ground by hand and fitted by guesswork. So most people simply learn to hold there, reading closer to the fire and squint gently through what the years have taken. Your back and belly have their own opinions about a life spent lifting, hauling and hoeing, and a hernia, a soft troubling bulge low in the abdomen, is common enough that a leather and metal truss strapped on beneath your shirt is as ordinary a piece of clothing as a hat, worn by men who accept that a body strained past a certain point does not fully mend itself again. Your back itself, after enough years bent over a hoe or hauling water yoked across your shoulders, aches in a way that stopped being news to you long ago, a low permanent complaint you have made peace with the way you have made peace with weather. By 35, your joints have logged decades of a working life inside them, wrists and knees stiff on cold mornings, hips that click on the stairs, and if you have stood near cannon fire or spent years hammering at a forge, your hearing has thinned along with everything else, voices arriving muffled as though spoken through a wall of wool. It is worth remembering that Benjamin Franklin himself lived to 84, decades of print shop labour and sugared tea doing what they would to his hands and his eyes and very likely his teeth. Proof enough that a hard-won body and a long life were never mutually exclusive. There is a strange comfort in realising the word old was never really about how many birthdays you had counted. It was a description of a body, worn the way a coat is worn, thin at the elbows, patched at the knees, still serviceable, still yours, carrying you forward whether or not it entirely agreed to the arrangement. You suspect there is an odd honesty in a world where age shows itself plainly on the skin and in the gait, rather than hiding behind a number nobody can verify, though you still wish more of your own teeth had lasted. At the washstand, you lean over a wide wooden bowl filled with well water, gone still, and before you dip the cloth in, you catch, for just a moment, your own face looking back up at you, and the water in the bowl settles, and the face looking back at you is tired around the eyes but not old. Not by the numbers of the world you left behind, and you dry your hands slowly. Because hands, more than any face, are what this country actually asks of you, and the day is not finished with you yet. You spend more of your waking life working than doing anything else, and colonial work has its own private habit of trying to kill you in ways that owe nothing to fever or throat distemper, which at least begin outside the body. The axe does not. You learn to fell timber the way you learn to breathe, swinging into an oak or a pine until the motion stops feeling like a decision. The danger is rarely the swing itself. It is the tree, because a trunk does not always fall where it means to, and a limb broken loose high in the canopy, hung up and waiting, can come down onto the man standing beneath it who believed the work was already finished. Men call these hung limbs widow-makers, which is either the plainest word this country owns or the cruelest joke it tells about itself, and you have never quite settled which. Once the tree is down, the slower work begins, because a felled forest is not a field, it is a graveyard of stumps, and clearing land means burning them out over days of low smoky fires that blacken the earth and leave you smelling of wood smoke for a week. It is patient, blistering, unglamorous labour, the kind nobody ever wrote a hymn about, though the whole farm depends on it getting done. Down at the gristmill, the danger changes shape. The great wheel turns slow and looks harmless, gearing and shafts groaning under a low wooden roof, meal dust hanging gold in the cracked light, and the miller moves among it all with the easy confidence of a man who has done this 10,000 times, which is itself the trouble, since familiarity teaches a hand to reach 1 inch too close to a turning gear. You will meet more than one miller missing a finger or two, and he will tell the story so lightly that you suspect he tells it partly to convince himself it was worth the trade. Then there are the animals, an entirely separate danger, because a horse or an ox is enormously strong, and only partly interested in your plans for the afternoon. Draft horses kick fast, faster than the eye follows, and a runaway cart behind a spooked team can drag a man some distance before anyone gets the reins back, over ruts and roots and whatever else the road happens to be holding. You learn to walk wide of hindquarters as a matter of plain religion, and oxen, slower as they generally are, still outweigh your good intentions by a wide and stubborn margin. Wells kill quietly, which is worse in its own way. Digging one means descending into a narrow shaft you line with stone as you go, foul air pooling at the bottom where you cannot see it, so a man can be overcome before he understands there is anything to be overcome by. Stoning the walls afterward is safer but no gentler, cold wet work where the rope above you is the only thread tying you back to daylight. Quarrying is its cousin in reverse, breaking rock instead of digging earth, asking the same steady hands and unhurried eyes, one moment of inattention at a time. The sea takes more men than any of it, and it takes them without ceremony. Fishing fleets go out past the point in weather that looks fine at dawn and does not stay that way, and coasting sloops running. Goods between one small harbour and the next answer to tides and shoals that do not care how well the pilot thinks he knows them. A small fishing port can lose a startling share of its working men to a single bad autumn, and everyone in that town already knows it, the way everyone knows which houses hold a widow this year who did not hold one last year. Historians still argue whether the fishing towns along this coast were simply unluckier than everywhere, else or only more honest about counting their dead, since the sea admits nothing and the town register admits everything. South of the fishing ports, in the tobacco fields, the killer is patience, and heat rather than any single violent moment. Long rows worked under a sun that does not let up, the same Chesapeake sun that breeds the standing water, and the ague. Nobody here yet understands, so the crop that makes a colony rich is grown by bodies slowly worn down by the very climate that also makes them sick. Quirky as it sounds, tobacco was for a long stretch of years valuable enough to serve as actual currency, weighed out and traded like coin, which meant your own field, leaf by leaf, was quite literally worth its weight in money. Almost none of this gets written down. The tidy way a birth or a death by fever gets written down. What survives instead are widows' petitions, women asking a court for support after a husband died felling timber, or was lost off a coasting sloop, or was crushed beneath a cart he no longer had the strength to hold, and probate records, the careful inventories taken after a man's death listing his axe, his oxen, his tools, down to the last iron wedge because someone has to divide up whatever remains. Read enough of them in sequence and you understand you are holding an accident ledger, except one written entirely in the language of property, as though the only proper way this world knew to mourn a man was to count, item by item, what he left behind him. You think about all of it on the walk home in the last low light, boots heavy with the day's dust, palms raw from rope or axe haft or plough handle, and the ache settling into your hands now is not the kind that worries you, not yet. Just the ordinary toll of an ordinary Tuesday, the kind every hand in this country carries home, and by the time you reach your own door, your hands have stopped aching from the day's work and started aching from the cold instead, which is how you know the season has properly turned. Inside is not much comfort. A colonial house does not really warm you so much as it draws a small, stingy border around the hearth, and past that border the room might as well be outdoors. Stand 3 feet from a fire built up with good split oak and roaring loud enough to hear across the room, and you can still watch your own breath cloud white in front of your face. Still feel the draught sliding under the door and along the floorboards like it has business elsewhere in the house. Leave ink standing in the inkwell overnight, and by morning it's a hard black coin of ice, and you must warm it between your palms or set it near the coals before you can write your own name. Bread left out on the table stiffens by morning into something you could rap your knuckles on. This is simply what a New England winter is, in a house built of thin clapboard, good intentions, and never quite enough wood. Wood is the whole argument of the season, and it never stops being an argument. A household burns through cord after cord before spring, split and stacked and seasoned wood, cut somewhere back of the house in autumn and hauled home by sled before the ground locks hard as iron. And it is never, ever quite enough, because a fireplace is a magnificent, wasteful thing that sends most of its heat straight up the chimney to warm the sky over your roof and precious little of it down to your feet. Some households manage this, more or less, by wrestling an enormous backlog into the hearth at bedtime. A single log so wide it takes 2 grown men to lift it, meant to smoulder low and slow through the family's sleep and hold a bed of coals till morning, which is either thrifty genius or simply the laziest possible answer to an entire season of cold, depending entirely on which of you did the cutting. And then there is fire's other face. A chimney is only a flue of dry soot and old pitch climbing straight up through a wooden house, and once a year or so, somewhere in town, a chimney catches, a roar overhead, a shower of sparks over the shingles, and the whole street turns out with buckets because a chimney fire in a town built this close together, this dry, this cold, is never just one family's trouble. Some towns hire a chimney sweep and fine you outright for a filthy flue, which tells you plainly enough how afraid a town made entirely of wooden houses and open hearths has learned to be of its own supper's cooking. Out on the roads it is worse still. A traveller caught between towns as the light fails and the snow thickens can lose the road entirely. Fences and stone walls buried soft and white, familiar landmarks gone, and cold like that works quietly, numbing the fingers first, then the feet, then, worst of all, the good sense that would tell you to stop walking in circles and find shelter under a bank or a fallen tree. Search parties go out with lanterns and dogs for anyone overdue by nightfall, and mostly, thank goodness, they are found in time. Mostly. Indoors, you seal every door and window against the draught, stuff rags into the cracks and crowd close around the one warm room in the house, which is a fine way to keep from freezing and an equally fine way to share every last cough in the household with everyone in it. Pleurisy stabs at your side with every breath you draw. Quinsy swells the throat nearly shut, until swallowing itself becomes the day's whole labour. Consumption, the long-wasting cough that never quite leaves a house once it has entered, always seems to settle in worse when the windows stay shut for months at a stretch, and winter fever, whatever it truly was in any given case, moves room to room through the sealed, smoky air the way gossip moves through a small town, quickly and touching very nearly everyone before spring. You measure the dark half of the year in candles now, tallow candles that smoke and gutter and smell, faintly and unmistakably, of the sheep they used to be, and by their light and the fires you sow and mend and read the almanac aloud, because the sun sets absurdly early and rises late, and offers most days only a pale grey hour or two worth calling daylight at all. Historians still argue whether it was the cold itself, or the clean upland water, or families arriving whole instead of scattered as single young men, that let people up here live so much longer than their cousins down in the tidewater south. A question this journey will circle back to before the night is through. But here, folded inside all this discomfort, is the strange gift nobody in the room would ever think to be grateful for. The very cold that freezes your ink solid and splits the skin on. Your knuckles also kills the mosquito outright, every autumn, root and larva and all, so that the fever stalking the Chesapeake all summer long simply has nowhere left to live through anew. England, January. It is entirely possible that surviving enough of these winters is a good part of why you might one day be an old man of 70 still standing on a meeting house step warm in the sun, remembering winters exactly like this one. Which is small comfort in February, the thinnest month of all, when the woodpile has shrunk to something you eye nervously each morning before you've even lit the fire, and the barrels of salted meat and the bins of dried peas down in the cellar have sunk low enough that you have caught yourself. More than once, quietly. You feel it first in the mud, not the calendar, the frost loosening its grip on the dooryard, water pooling where the path used to be solid ground, and by the time a green haze softens the trees you have almost forgotten the thin cold ache of February. Spring in the Chesapeake and the Carolina low country arrives all at once. The way a held breath finally lets go, and close behind it comes a smell you dread more than any frost. The low, sweetish reek of standing water beside the house in the roadside ditches around the mill pond. Out along the rice fields where the water is kept flooded on purpose, because that is simply how rice grows. Nobody thinks of that water as an enemy. Most mornings it looks almost pretty, flat and silver, striped with the shadows of cattails. You would need very good eyes to see what is breeding just under its surface, drifting in neat little wriggling commas, and even if you saw it clearly you would think nothing of it, because not one soul in your world, not the minister, not the physician down from Williamsburg with his lancet and his Latin, not your own grandmother, who has buried more neighbours than she can count, suspects the mosquito of anything at all. They suspect the air instead. Bad air, rising off the marsh at dusk, thick and low and faintly visible if the evening is cool enough. This is miasma, and it is the leading suspect behind nearly everything that ails you, from a head cold to childbed fever to what the old parish records call, plainly and often, the ague, or sometimes agues and fevers, bundled together like one tiresome relative who visits every summer and always overstays. The word malaria will not settle into English in your lifetime, but it is already forming in the old country tongues as malaria, literally bad air, because that is genuinely what everyone believes is making them sick, right up until a day more than a century after your own, when someone finally thinks to blame the bite instead of the breeze. You will find that almost funny later. The mosquito landing on your wrist in June had the finest alibi any small creature ever enjoyed, since the whole household stood at the window glaring suspiciously at the evening air instead. What you cannot ignore is the rhythm. The ague does not simply arrive and depart, it keeps time better than most clocks in the house. You shiver first, teeth chattering under 3 blankets in the middle of July, and then the fever climbs, hour by hour, sweat soaking clean through your shift. And then it breaks, leaving you hollow but almost yourself again. And then, with a punctuality that would embarrass the church bell, it returns 2 days later to the hour. Tertian, the physicians call it, from the counting fever, a well day, fever, another well day, on and on. Families plan around it the way they plan around market day, and you could, with something close to confidence, warn a neighbour exactly which afternoon next week to expect you shaking in your bed. A small mercy, or a small cruelty, depending on how tired you already are of being right. This is why the Chesapeake and the Carolina Low Country earn their grim reputation, while Massachusetts, cold and rocky and comparatively dry, largely escapes it. New England's hard winters kill the mosquito outright, freeze the standing water solid, empty the marshes of anything that bites. A Puritan farmstead may suffer plenty of its own troubles, but rarely this one, not the way a tidewater plantation does, ringed by flooded rice fields and slow brown rivers that never quite freeze and never quite drain. Historians still argue whether it was the tainted water supply or the fever arriving aboard the ships that did the greater damage to the earliest Chesapeake settlements, but nobody argues that the hotter, swampier colonies paid a steeper price, summer after summer, than their northern cousins ever did. If you can afford it, there is one true remedy worth knowing, even though almost nobody around you understands why it works. Peruvian bark, cinchona, ground from the trunk of a South American tree, shipped at considerable expense and weighed out by the ounce like something precious. Because it is. Tastes bitter beyond describing. Bitter enough that you stir it into wine or sugar water just to get it down. And it is also, almost alone among the remedies in your world, genuinely effective. Nobody knows that this is because of a compound called quinine. Nobody in your century has the faintest notion what a compound even is. They only know the bark works, that the shaking stops, that a man who takes it faithfully often recovers where a man who cannot afford it does not, and so it becomes the one thing in the sick room worth going into debt for, dosed out carefully, hoarded through the winter and, being expensive, quietly counterfeited by merchants happy to sell you the ground bark of a far less useful tree and let your fever sort out the difference. And here is the quiet trick the ague plays on the record books, the trick that will confuse anyone trying to count your dead centuries from now. It rarely kills you outright, on its own, in a single dramatic afternoon. It wears you down instead, season after season, leaving you thin, your blood poor, your strength borrowed, so that when the flux comes through, or the winter fever, or simple exhaustion finally catches up, that second visitor gets the blame written into the parish register, while the ague that spent years quietly hollowing you out goes unmentioned entirely. A death recorded as fever, or decline, or simply sickness, may have had malaria, standing patiently behind it every single time, which is one reason the old records are so much less trustworthy than they first appear. By evening the heat finally breaks, just barely, and you find yourself standing at the edge of the fields where the ditches run, and the rice water lies flat and still under a sky gone the colour of a healing bruise, purple sliding slowly into grey, and you become aware in that half-conscious way you notice things at dusk of a single, high, thin whine beginning somewhere close to your ear, and by the third night the shivering has settled in for good, and someone in the house has already sent a boy riding for the doctor, because whatever is happening inside you plainly needs a professional opinion, and out here the professional arrives by moonlight, saddlebags creaking, and stands blinking in your doorway, smelling of horse and cold night air. He is no stranger to fever. He has seen the Ugg before up and down this same low wet country, has ridden out on nights colder and darker than this one, and he carries with him an entire theory of what your body is and how it has gone wrong. That theory is humoral, and it is centuries old, and it explains everything, at least to him. Your body, in this understanding, holds 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and health is nothing more than these 4 sitting in the proper proportion, quiet and balanced, like 4 sleepy roommates who mostly get along. Illness, then, is simply imbalance, too much of one humour, too little of another, the mixture gone sour or thick or overheated. The fever burning through you now is read as an excess of blood grown too abundant and too hot, pressing outward and needing in the doctor's calm understanding to be let back out. Before he touches you at all, though, someone closes the window, because the night air itself is thought dangerous. Miasma, the bad air rising off the marsh and the standing water, believed to carry sickness on its own breath. Nobody here has heard of a mosquito's part in any of this, so the window comes down, the shutter is latched, and the room grows close and warm around you, which feels, if you're honest, almost cosier than it should, given what is supposedly rising out there to finish you off. The doctor's bag, when it opens on the coverlet beside you, creaks on its worn hinge and holds instruments you half expect and one that makes you go very still. There is the lancet, small and neat, a folding blade meant for a single fine cut, and the fleam, its country cousin, sharper-edged and quicker to hand. And there is the bleeding bowl, shallow and pewter, with faint measuring rings pressed into its inner wall so the doctor can watch, calmly, exactly how much of you is leaving. The bleeding itself is done without drama, a practised motion, a controlled trickle, a cloth pressed after, and the whole business is described by everyone present, in the mild, business-like language of housekeeping, as though your body were simply being tidied up. He may also reach for calomel, a pale powder that is, though nobody here would phrase it quite this way, chiefly mercury, prescribed to purge you thoroughly from the other direction, on the theory that whatever is unbalanced inside you should be encouraged firmly toward the door. There may be a blistering plaster too, raised hot against your skin to draw the corrupted humours up to the surface where they can be dealt with properly, and there may be an emetic besides to empty your stomach, on the reasoning that emptiness itself is a form of correction. Between the bleeding, the purging, the blistering and the vomiting you are by morning considerably lighter than you were in every sense, and it is a quiet, private, 3 a.m. sort of question whether you feel this way because you are healing or because you have simply been thoroughly emptied. This whole approach carries a name, heroic medicine, and the word heroic is doing a great deal of quiet, hard-working labour in that phrase, because the heroism, such as it is, belongs mostly to the treatment and not obviously to the outcome. It asks a great deal of the patient, blood, sleep, strength, appetite, dignity, all surrendered at once, in the sincere belief that a dramatically sick body calls for an equally dramatic answer. And here is the gentle part worth holding on to in the dark. The doctor bent over your bed is no villain, no swindler, no stranger to genuine care. He is reasoning as carefully as he knows how from a premise that happens to be wrong, the way a man might follow a perfectly logical map of a country that does not, in fact, exist. The most famous believer in all of this, a Philadelphia physician utterly convinced that copious bleeding could cure almost anything set before it, is a man named Benjamin Rush, and you will meet him again, later, in a far hotter and far more crowded year, 1793. But that is a story for another night, and we will leave him here for now, bag in hand, quietly certain he is right. Historians still argue whether Rush's bleeding killed more patients than the fevers he was bleeding them for, and it is the sort of argument likely never to fully settle, because the sick and the merely worried alike were bled back then, almost as routine upkeep, the way you might sharpen a knife whether or not it actually needed it. Quaint as it sounds tonight, tucked warm under your own blanket, this was, at the time, the very best science available, practiced by educated, well-meaning men who trained for years to do precisely what your doctor is doing now, gently, competently, entirely by candlelight. And there is a small, strange comfort in one thing at least. Nobody in this room tonight believes you are cursed, or possessed, or being punished for some private failing. Only unbalanced, only requiring correction, only a body waiting patiently to be set right again, the way a wagon wheel is levered carefully back onto true. The doctor works unhurried, murmuring instructions to whoever is holding the basin, while outside the shuttered window the marsh keeps its own indifferent counsel, caring nothing for bleeding bowls or blistering plasters. Finished at last, he wipes the lancet clean, folds it back into its worn leather case beside the fleam, and closes the clasp of his bag with a soft final click, and the sound of the horse's hooves fades down the lane before the bag has even finished swinging against his leg, and now it is just you again, and the house, and whatever remedies live inside it that never needed a fee to fetch them. Most households cannot call a physician twice a year, let alone twice a week, so the real medicine of your life happens here, at your own hearth, dispensed by your own hands, out of jars and books and memory, long before any hoofbeat is heard coming back up the lane again. Somewhere on a shelf, spine soft with handling, sits a small, cheap, enormously popular book called Every Man His Own Doctor, or The Poor Planter's Physician, written by a Scottish-born physician named John Tennant, first printed in Virginia in 1734, and it promises right there in the title that you do not need him, or anyone like him, ever again. Benjamin Franklin liked the book enough to print it himself in Philadelphia that same year and again 2 years later, and later still in German for readers who wanted their bleeding instructions in their own mother tongue, which tells you something about how far a useful little pamphlet could travel when nobody owned the copyright on good advice. Tennant had sailed for Virginia himself around 1725, practiced medicine out in Spotsylvania, and Caroline counties among people who could not always get to him either, and he filled his book with cures for everything between the vapours, those fashionable fainting fits nobody could quite locate in the body, and cancer itself, as though the same short list of remedies might reasonably stretch to cover both. Open it and the advice repeats like a chorus. Bleed yourself, drink an herb tea, and for heaven's sake stop eating meat, which is either sound 17th century wisdom or a diet plan dressed up as medicine. And honestly, at this distance, it is hard to say which. But tucked into the pamphlet, next to all that repetitive bleeding and abstaining, is one remedy Tennant championed with real conviction. Seneca rattlesnake root, taken for pleurisy, that sharp stabbing pain in the chest with every breath. He had not invented it. He had learned it by his own account from native practice, from people who had been treating pleurisy and snakebite with that root long before any Englishman's ship reached this river. And it is worth sitting with that for a moment, the fact that the one part of this whole self-help volume that actually seems to have done some good arrived by way of exactly the knowledge Tennant's neighbours were busy dismissing everywhere else, learned at some fireside or riverbank you will never know the name of, and carried into print under an Englishman's byline alone. If you cannot afford Tennant's little book, or even if you can, there is still the almanac hanging by its string near the hearth, thumbed soft at the corners, its pages full of weather guesses and planting dates, and tucked in among them a bleeding chart and the zodiac man, that small woodcut figure ringed with the signs, Aries at the head and Pisces at the feet, telling you which stars govern which organ and which day of the month is safest to open a vein, which is either careful medical planning or astrology wearing a lab coat, and you may draw your own conclusions. Beyond the almanac there is the receipt book, not receipts in the sense of a shop's paper slip, but recipes, handwritten, a stitched and dog-eared little volume passed mother to daughter to granddaughter, its pages a stew of pie crusts and plague water, and a poultice for a burn all crowded onto the same page in 3 different hands and 3 different inks, because nobody kept separate books for cooking and doctoring when the same herbs and the same patient hands did both, the ink browning a little more with every decade the book survives a new set of fingers. If the receipt book fails, or the almanac or Tennant, there is always the minister, who doctors half his parish between sermons, because he owns the only shelf of medical texts for 20 miles and rides out, to bedsides on the same horse he rides to funerals, and because doctoring, like preaching, is mostly about sitting with people at the worst hour of their lives and having something, anything, to offer them. Historians still argue whether these lay and clerical practitioners did more good than the trained physicians riding their circuits with lancets and calomel, and given how the physician's own methods so often ran, it is not an easy case to make in the physician's favour. Behind the house, if the household is careful, there is a small herb garden fenced against the goats, planted with feverfew and tansy and horehound and mint. the rows a little crooked, the smell of crushed leaf rising warm off your fingers whenever you brush past at midday, planted and weeded by whoever in the family has the patience for it, which in most houses means the women, always the women, tending the plants exactly as they tend the sick room. Because in this world, those two tasks were never really separate to begin with, and never once got the same credit. And here is the honest part, the part worth saying plainly before the candle gutters any lower. Some of it worked. Not the bleeding, not most of the purging, but the willow bark that eased a fever, the mint that settled a stomach, the rattlesnake root that truly seemed to help a laboured pleuritic breath. Accumulated household knowledge, tested against real bodies over real years, sitting there quietly beside the nonsense, indistinguishable to the eye, and it is left to you and to time to sort out which jar on the stillroom shelf. In this low golden light, with the day's herbs still drying overhead, and the last sun coming sideways through the small window, actually holds a cure, and which one only holds a comfort, and which merely holds a very old, very confident guess. The labels fading, the corks dark with age, the whole shelf waiting patiently for whichever hand reaches for it next. And none of those jars will help you now. However carefully labelled, however faithfully copied from Reverend Tennant's own recipes, because in April of 1721 a ship eases into Boston harbour carrying smallpox tucked into its hold and its rigging and the cough of one sailor nobody thought to worry about. And by the time anyone does worry, the whole town is already breathing the same tarred rope and salt fog it always has, only now carrying something no amount of airing. The rooms will chase back out. Between April and December, you watch the number climb the way you'd watch a tide come in against a wall you cannot move. 5,889 Bostonians fall sick, 844 of them die, out of a town of only about 11,000 souls, which works out to something close to 7.5 people in every 100 you. No, call it about 7.6% gone by Christmas. October is the cruelest month of it. 411 deaths inside 31 days, more than 13 a day, and the meeting house bell seems to toll for someone every time you're within earshot of it. You find yourself doing that arithmetic before breakfast now, quietly, the way some people used to count sheep to fall asleep. Except this counting keeps you awake, and the small beer in your cup tastes no different than it ever did, which somehow feels like the strangest part of all. Somewhere in the middle of it, word of a possible remedy reaches the Reverend Cotton Mather, and it reaches him from two directions that could hardly be less alike. One is a bound journal carried across the ocean at the slow, dignified pace of the Royal Society's own philosophical transactions, full of learned gentlemen describing curiosities of nature months after the fact, which is the same trouble your own letters have, only with fewer curiosities and far graver consequences. The other, and the one that matters far more, is a man named Onesimus, whom Mather holds enslaved in his own household, and it is Onesimus, not the journal, who tells him first and tells him plainly. Onesimus describes a practice from his homeland in West Africa, a deliberate, careful giving of the illness in a small and chosen dose, before the town's own uncontrolled version arrives and takes its pick of who lives, and he rolls back his sleeve and shows Mather the scar to prove it, a mark long healed, carrying inside it the whole argument for what Boston might try next. Whatever credit history hands out afterward, it is worth saying plainly here in the dark that the idea did not begin with a minister or a physician or a distant learned society. It began with a man Boston refused to call free, describing a wisdom his own homeland had practiced long before Boston even had a name for the sickness. Historians still argue whether Onesimus should be credited as the true origin of American inoculation, since it was his knowledge, carried from home and proven on his own body, that set the entire chain of events moving, well before any fellow of the Royal Society ever put pen to paper about it. It is a small, strange thing worth sitting with tonight. The name Onesimus is itself borrowed from an old story about a man who returns transformed, and this Onesimus, unfree and largely unthanked in his own lifetime, becomes the reason an entire city eventually turns and faces its plague differently. Mather carries the idea to Dr. Zabdiel Boylston, and to his considerable nerve, Boylston does not merely write a pamphlet about it. He tries it himself on his own household. He inoculates his own son first, and then 2 enslaved members of his own household, cutting a small wound and introducing a measured trace of the disease on the reasoning that a chosen, gentle dose beats a hidden, cruel one arriving on its own schedule. Word of what he has done runs through Boston faster than any journal ever could, through kitchens and taverns and church porches alike. By the time the epidemic finally loosens its grip, Boylston has inoculated 247 people, and 6 of them die, a rate of 2.5 in every 100, set against nearly 15 in every 100 among those who catch the smallpox by ordinary bad luck. On paper, laid out in neat columns by candlelight, it is not really a close argument at all. On the street, it feels like a very close argument indeed, because on the street stands Dr. William Douglas, and Douglas will hear none of it. He leads the opposition with the particular confidence of a man who has read every one of the right books and is nonetheless about to be wrong in front of the entire town anyway. He is far from alone in this. Most of Boston's physicians and most of Boston's ordinary people stand with him. They believe, quite sincerely, that inoculation spreads the very disease it claims to prevent, that it might simply kill the patient outright instead of sparing him, and that the wound cut open to let a small sickness in leaves the whole body ajar, exposed, for every other illness waiting patiently outside the door. Somebody in Boston takes the argument a good deal further than words or pamphlets or shouted sermons. A lit grenade sails through Cotton Mather's own window one night, with a note tied to it so nobody could mistake the message for an accident, and by whatever mercy or faulty fuse governs such things, it does not explode. Boston, it turns out, will not be settling this particular argument by bombing, however tempting the notion apparently was to somebody with very poor aim and considerably worse judgment. So the town spends the rest of its year like that, sickening and arguing and inoculating and burying, through a summer that will not cool, and an autumn that saves its very worst for October. Wool coats and wood smoke, and the low murmur of names read out from the meeting-house steps. And by December, with the fever finally letting go of one street after another, Boston begins the strange, careful business of counting itself. You count with them that December, the number closing on itself the way a ledger closes on a Saturday night, and you carry the arithmetic with you when you leave Boston behind. 247 inoculated, 6 dead, a mortality of 2 4/10%, set beside 14 8/10% for the pox caught the plain and honest way. It ought to settle the matter in an afternoon. It does not. You will carry this same argument through 50 more years of colonial life, town by town, watching people who have seen the numbers, who have heard the numbers read aloud from a pulpit even, choose fear over arithmetic again and again, because fear, unlike smallpox, does not wait its turn, where a town does agree to try it. The sick, or rather the soon-to-be sick, since inoculation makes patients out of the perfectly healthy, are kept apart, in a low building set back from the meeting-house and the well-travelled roads, sometimes at the town's edge, sometimes on an island in the harbour, a place with a plain name and a plainer purpose, the inoculation house. You go there weeks in advance, not to be made sick yet, but to be prepared for it, and preparation in your century means dieting and purging, a course of thin broths and vegetables and repeated visits to the necessary, your physician insisting that your blood must be thinned and your body emptied before it can safely be given something to fight. It is, by modern lights, an odd way to get ready for an illness. Starve yourself half well first, so you can afford to get properly sick on purpose, though you will find, if you ask around, that nobody in your century thinks this the least bit strange, only expensive and tedious, which in fairness is often how medicine feels, regardless of the century you happen to be lying awake in. Whether a town gets an inoculation house at all is not decided by physicians. It is decided at town meeting, the same forum that argues over fences and ministers' salaries and the price of hogs running loose. An inoculation loses there as often as it wins, voted down by neighbours who fear, not unreasonably by their own lights, that a house full of deliberately infected people a quarter-mile off will not stay a quarter-mile off, that the pox will walk out the door on somebody's shoe and into the well water and the wash and the church pew. Historians still argue whether Onesimus, the man Cotton Mather enslaved and who first described inoculation to him from his own homeland, ought to be remembered as the true origin of the whole American practice, or merely as the spark that Mather and Boylston happened to catch and carry forward. But either way, the argument he started in 1721 is still being fought, meeting by meeting, 50 years on. And then, having survived the dieting and the purging and the town's suspicion of you, you arrive at the strange centre of the whole procedure. You are made sick, deliberately, by a physician who draws a thread through a blister on someone already recovering and carries it, still faintly damp, to a small cut opened in your own arm. Nothing dramatic follows at first. Then within a week or 10 days it does. A fever, an ache settling into the back and head, a scattering of pox far lighter than the disease would leave on you in the wild, and 2 or 3 weeks of being genuinely, unmistakably ill, kept warm, kept fed on broth, watched closely by whoever agreed to nurse you through a sickness everyone in the room chose on purpose, together. It is a peculiar kind of courage, choosing your own illness with your eyes wide open, and you notice that the people who choose it most readily are often the very ones who have already buried someone the disease chose for them instead. By 1776, the argument has travelled a long way from Cotton Mather's broken window. Abigail Adams in Boston with her children while her husband sits arguing independence in Philadelphia has herself and every one of them inoculated that summer, choosing the fever and the pox and the weeks of confinement over the far worse odds of catching the disease from a passing army or a crowded, frightened, wartime town, a decision made quietly by a mother, though a general is about to make the very same one for thousands of men at once. The general is Washington, and the year is 1777, and what he orders may be the single most consequential public health decision of the entire revolution: the mass inoculation of the Continental Army, an army that has already lost more men to camp sickness than to British muskets, an army that cannot afford to let smallpox move through its winter huts the way it has moved through every other army anyone can remember. It is, on paper, a wild risk, deliberately disabling thousands of soldiers for weeks, all at once, in the middle of a war, trusting that Boylston's old arithmetic still holds true. It holds. And somewhere inside that decision sits the driest joke this whole grim century has to offer you. The general who cannot yet win a battle wins part of the war by making his own army sick on purpose, and then simply waiting for them to get better. You come to understand, watching all this from inside your own patched and healing sleeve, that the danger was never really in question. Inoculation could, and now and then did, kill, and every family weighing it knew that plainly only the comparison mattered, 2 4/10 against 14 8/10, a wager that looked reckless up close and obviously sound from any distance, at all. And you come to understand something else, something no town meeting clerk ever thought to write into the minutes, that a smallpox scar, pitted faintly and healed pale on the forearm, becomes its own kind of paper, read at a glance by strangers, proof that you are already safe, already spared, already fit to be hired, to be trusted, to be sent into a dying neighbour's room with nothing standing between you and the disease but a healed, scarred arm. That scar on your arm has long since faded to a thin, pale seam, easy to forget under a sleeve, and yet here you are again, decades on, standing in Philadelphia in the August heat of 1793, breathing air that has gone strange and sweetish, thick with the smell of vinegar and burning pitch that people are lighting on street corners, in the hope of driving off whatever this is. It begins quietly, a few deaths blamed on spoiled coffee unloaded at the wharves, and then it does not stop. Between the 1st of August and the 9th of November, roughly 11,000 people in this city fall ill, and about 5,000 die, something close to a tenth of the whole population of the nation's capital, gone in a single season. Church bells that once rang for services now ring so often for funerals that some households ask the ringers to stop, unable to bear the sound. The wealthy who can afford it pack their trunks and leave for the countryside, the streets emptying of carriages, and the ones who remain are the poor, the stubborn, the officials who cannot leave their posts, and the ones with nowhere else to go. Dr. Benjamin Rush is here too, the same physician you met years ago with his gleaming lancet and his certainty has not softened with age. He is convinced the fever is an inflammation of the blood, and his cure is heroic in the old sense of the word, copious bloodletting drawn again and again, followed by calomel to purge the bowels, a mercury compound that will do exactly what it promises and more. He treats something like 100 patients a day, moving from sick room to sick room with the tireless confidence of a man who has never once doubted himself. His coat spattered, his patients pale and weak long before the fever alone could account for it, and it is almost restful to watch, if you do not know what the lancet is doing to the basin beneath the bed. He catches the fever himself before autumn is out, and treats his own bleeding with the very same method he gives everyone else, which tells you something about the size of his conviction, if not the soundness of it. Most of the city's other physicians want nothing to do with his approach. They favour gentler sweating, mild purgatives, and rest. And the two camps argue in the newspapers with a ferocity that would almost be funny if the subject printed in those columns were not so many empty beds. Historians still argue whether Rush's bleeding killed more people than the fever itself ever did. He's desperate for hands, though, because there are not enough physicians in the world for a city drowning like this one, and he turns to an old and false idea drawn from older medical treatises, the claim that black people are naturally immune to yellow fever. On the strength of that belief, He asks Richard Allen and Absalom Jones of the Free African Society they founded together on the 12th of April in 1787 to organise their community to nurse the sick and to stay in the city when nearly everyone able to leave has already gone. And they stay. They nurse strangers in fever-soaked beds. They cart the ill through streets gone eerily silent. They dig graves by the dozen and bury the dead when there's no one else left to do it. Working through weeks that would break most people, asking little and receiving less. They are not immune, whatever the old books claimed. They sicken and die in numbers just like everyone else around them, and still they keep going, because the work does not stop simply because the belief that sent them into it was wrong. Their nights are as long as their days, and their patience through it all does not run out. Some who watch them work will later call it duty. You might just as easily call it the plainest kind of courage this whole grim season has to offer. When it's over, the writer Matthew Carey publishes a popular account of the epidemic, a bestseller that goes through several printings, and it manages to slight the very people who kept the city standing, painting their labour as something closer to opportunism than sacrifice. Allen and Jones will not let that stand quietly. The following year they publish their own answer, a pamphlet called A Narrative of the Proceedings of the Black People during the late awful calamity in Philadelphia, setting the record straight in their own words, plainly, calmly, and with a dignity Carey never once offered them. It stands as one of the earliest published defences by black Americans of their own community's honour, written by two men who had just spent a summer burying their neighbours and had every right to say so. Out past the city's edge sits Bush Hill, a grand country mansion pressed suddenly into service as a fever hospital, its once elegant rooms filled instead with rows of cots, and the low murmur of the dying and the just surviving, the fine plaster ceilings looking down on scenes nobody who built the house could have imagined. You could, if you wished, count the barrels of vinegar burned on the street corners that autumn, and never reach a satisfying number. Philadelphia tries gunfire to clear the bad air, tar smoke, camphor bags worn round the neck, and none of it, of course, is the thing that actually helps. What helps, in the end, is something nobody in 1793 understands is even happening. The small winged carriers of the fever are dying off as the nights turn cold. The sickness does not retreat because of any boil or any bleeding. It simply runs out of the mosquitoes that had been spreading it all along quietly, from one open barrel of standing water to the next. By early November, the deaths begin at last to slow, and on a cold morning in the second week the first hard frost settles white over the rooftops of Philadelphia, and the whole grieving city, still counting its dead, begins carefully to breathe again. But a city breathing again is not the same as a colony counting its dead evenly, and underneath every number this episode has given you tonight runs a colder, older arithmetic, a ledger kept carefully in ink that decided whose death would be written down and whose would simply vanish from the page. Most of the men and women who crossed to the Chesapeake in the 17th century were not adventurers arriving to land waiting for them. They were servants, filling the same crowded holds you have already ridden through in this journey. The weevil biscuit and the water gone green in the cask, except that for them the crossing itself was the payment. You could cross the Atlantic without a shilling in your pocket because a ship's captain would carry you, for free, the moment you signed your name or made your mark to a contract called an indenture. The word describes how the paper itself was made, 2 copies of the same agreement written side by side on one sheet, then the sheet cut apart along a deliberately wavy-toothed line so that later, if anyone doubted the document, the 2 halves could be laid back together and the jagged edges would match, tooth for tooth, like a broken plate fitted whole again. 1 half stayed with you, 1 half went to the master who had paid your fare, what you had signed away, in exchange for a passage across an ocean you could never otherwise have afforded was measured out in years, commonly 4, sometimes 5, occasionally 7, years of your labour, planting corn between the tobacco rows, splitting rails, hauling water, rising before light and stopping only after dark, your hands blistering to calluses under a sun far harder than any you had known at home, owed entire to somebody else. At the far end of that term, custom and often the contract itself promised freedom dues, a suit of clothes, a few tools, sometimes a little corn or money, occasionally even a small plot of land, enough to begin again as a free person in a new country. It was, on paper, a fair enough bargain, drawn up by 17th century lawyers who took considerably more care wording the promise than anyone ever took enforcing it. But the Chesapeake was not kind to paper promises. A servant stepping off the ship still had to live through the seasoning you already know about, the fevers of a first humid summer beside standing water that smelled thick and green even at a distance, and only then could the years begin their slow, count toward freedom dues that a great many servants never lived to collect. Through the early decades of Virginia's settlement, only about 1 crossing in 6 ended with a colonist still standing at the far side of it, and it was servants, young, single, and considered expendable in a way whole migrating families were not, who made up most of those crossings. Even a servant who survived the seasoning might still lose the years to accident, to childbed, to the same crowded contagions that emptied nurseries elsewhere in this episode, before a single freedom due was ever paid out. Historians still argue whether the surviving plantation records genuinely capture how many servants died before their time was served, or whether the true toll is an undercount, since an account book had no particular reason to be thorough about a servant who simply stopped appearing in its columns one season and was never mentioned again. What is not in dispute is the plain, chilling bookkeeping the law itself allowed. When a servant died before the term was served, that death could be entered in an estate's accounts as a loss of property, filed alongside a drowned ox or a dead horse, because the years still owed on that contract belonged, on paper, to somebody else. A ledger, it turns out, has never once paused mid-column to ask whether the loss it was recording could feel the cold, set beside that a deeper and graver injustice, one this journey has circled without naming outright until now. Enslaved people were brought to these colonies against their will, carried across that same ocean, under conditions no contract described and no freedom dues ever waited to reward, because there was no end of term written down for them at all, no wavy cut paper, no half kept back as a promise of anything, and no year, however many, that would ever be called enough. Nowhere in British North America were the odds of survival worse than in the rice-growing low country of coastal Carolina. Rice cultivation demanded flooded fields, banks of raised earth holding standing water across the growing season on purpose, and that standing water bred the same mosquitoes that made the Chesapeake dangerous, except here the fever they carried returned not once in a bad summer, but year after year after year, season upon season, in the wet heat and the standing green water and the biting dusk, without the dry relief that other colonies at least sometimes received. The mortality recorded in those rice fields exceeded anything else this episode has described, worse than Jamestown's early churchyards, worse than any city's epidemic autumn, worse than the seasoning itself. And here is the imbalance sitting underneath every figure in this episode. A free colonist's death was the kind of death that got written down, mourned from a pulpit, marked with a slate stone and a winged skull, entered into a parish register a historian centuries later could open and count. An enslaved person's death was, far more often, recorded only in the same cold columns that tracked barrels of rice and bushels of corn, a name reduced to an entry, a life reduced to a valuation, grief permitted to no one on the page even where it was certainly felt off it. Statistics, as a discipline, has always been better at addition than at mourning. Every average this episode has offered you tonight, every tidy life expectancy, every neat percentage of children, lost or servants surviving, was built from the records that happened to survive, and the records that survived were kept, overwhelmingly, by and for the free. The ledger closes, and when the ledger closes, when the clerk racks his pen and blows the candle out over that final tally, you find yourself already moving again. North this time, out of the tobacco counties and the rice checks and up into a colder country, under the same king, in the same century, and yet the numbers waiting for you there belong almost to a different world entirely. Here, among the Puritan towns of Massachusetts and Connecticut, and the Maine woods, where a midwife might someday walk her rounds with a bag of dried herbs, you have a real chance, if you get past the cradle, of growing old, properly old, the kind of old where your hands shake a little pouring cider, and your grandchildren roll their eyes at a story they've heard 40 times before. 70 is not a miracle here. It is almost an expectation, a lifespan you could set beside a person living centuries later and find surprisingly little difference between the two of you. Set that against the Chesapeake you left behind, or the Chesapeake your cousin sailed for instead. There, a white man who survived to 20, who made it, who was seasoned, who kept his fever down through that terrible third summer, could still expect, on average, only another 20-odd years, a life expectancy hovering somewhere around 43, worn down again and again by the marshes and the AUs you have already spent whole evenings walking through in this journey. And behind him, in that same colony, roughly 1 child in 4 never lived to see a first birthday, and another quarter never made it out of their teens at all. So that a Chesapeake churchyard, walked slowly and read stone by stone, would break your heart long before you reached the gate. It is a strange thing to sit with, in the dark, turning it over. The same century, the same empire, the same distant king pressed onto the same coins jingling in everyone's pocket, from the tobacco wharves to the Boston waterfront, and yet two populations, separated by only a few hundred miles of coastline, living lives that differ not by a few years but by whole aching decades, as though the crossing itself had quietly dropped some colonists into a hard, short 1650, and carried others, without anyone quite noticing, into an old age nobody in Virginia was ever allowed to reach. Ask a New England Puritan why, and if he's feeling pious, he'll credit Providence. But the more honest answer starts with the weather he spent the whole winter complaining about. A New England winter is long, and hard and about as forgiving as the deacon who runs the meeting house, and it does something prayer alone never quite managed. It kills the mosquito, kills it dead, every single year. So the malaria breeding so comfortably in the warm Chesapeake shallows never gets a foothold this far north. The water helps too. Where the Chesapeake dug its wells into tidal mud and drank, without knowing it, a slow trickle of its own waste, New England's farms sit above clean upland streams and wells cut straight down into rock. Water that tastes of stone rather than salt. Water that never quietly carries the whole town's sickness back around to its own supper table each summer. And then there is simply who came. The Chesapeake filled its ships mostly with young men, sent over alone by the boatload, indentured and unrelated and far from anyone who might nurse them through a bad fever. New England filled its ships with families, husbands and wives and children and grandparents, whole households crossing together, so that when sickness did arrive, there was usually somebody in the next room to spoon broth, share the last of the salt pork, and simply refuse to let you die by yourself. The towns themselves helped as well, laid out compact around a green and a meeting house, even while the actual farmland spread out loosely into the surrounding hills, a pattern that kept neighbours close enough for a church bell or a doctor to reach you, without ever crowding you shoulder to shoulder the way a garrison tobacco port sometimes did. And then, this being history, there is the sly reason, the one that should make you just slightly suspicious of every clean number in this whole episode. New England kept extraordinary records. Town clerks logged births and deaths and marriages the way a miser logs coins. Ministers noted the cause of every death in the parish register in their own careful hand, and a diligent Hallowell midwife could fill nearly 10,000 diary pages over 27 years without once thinking she was doing anything unusual, which means New England looks healthier partly because New England wrote things down. A colony too busy dying to keep a proper ledger simply fades from the historical record looking, on paper, almost peaceful. It leaves behind a strange, quiet kind of immortality, outliving your century by leaving a good enough paper trail. Historians centuries later have been able to reconstruct entire Puritan towns this way, name by name, birth by death by remarriage, a feat of patient genealogical digging that would make even the nosiest neighbour blush, all because somebody once decided a christening was worth writing down in a book nobody ever got around to throwing away. Historians still argue whether New England's long lives came down mostly to climate, or to water, or to family structure, or simply to better record keeping. And the honest answer is probably some tangle of all four, stirred slowly together over 5 or 6 generations until nobody can fully separate the ingredients anymore. Whatever the mixture, walk through any of these towns on a quiet afternoon, and you will find the proof sitting right there in plain sight. No argument required. An old man on the meeting house step, coat buttoned against a wind that doesn't trouble him the way it once did, watching the militia muster down on the green below him, watching boys not yet 20 check their flints and their powder horns, and understanding something about survival that not one of them knows yet. You know that the flint matters less than they think, and the powder less still, because the war they are marching toward, whether it is one of the colonial wars or the revolution itself, will not mostly be decided by any of that. You could tell them, if you thought they would believe you, that the muster field is the safest place they will stand all year, and that the real danger waits for them somewhere far duller than a battle line, a ditch, a barrel of standing water, a shared blanket still faintly warm from the last man who slept under it. Through every one of these wars, colonial and revolutionary alike, far more soldiers die of dysentery, of smallpox, of the low creeping sickness the men call camp fever, than ever die of a musket ball. And you know it the way you only know a thing after it has already cost you something. Picture what a camp actually is, because it is not the tidy rows of white tents you might be imagining. It is a few hundred men and boys, sometimes a few thousand, pitched together on borrowed ground in canvas and green log huts, closer to one another, night after night, than any of them have ever lived to their own kin. A farm boy who grew up seeing perhaps 30 people in a good month now sleeps within arm's reach of strangers from every county in the colony, breathing the same wood smoke, drinking from the same slow-moving creek, and standing, whether he knows it or not, at the centre of the deadliest classroom in his short life. The latrines do not help. They are dug, more often than any quartermaster would like to admit, too shallow and too close to the very water the camp also drinks from, so that a single rainy week can quietly connect the two, the same trick Jamestown played on itself without meaning to, replayed now by armies that ought to have learned better. You would think, after a century and a half of colonists poisoning their own wells, that someone would have written it into the standing orders in large letters. Someone occasionally did. Nobody apparently could ever quite make an army read it. Add to that the canteens passed hand to hand along a marching column, the single shared blanket stretched thin over 3 cold men in a hut built for 2, and the wool coat that never fully dries between one rainstorm and the next, and you have built, with the very best of intentions, a machine for spreading exactly the fevers you were hoping the enemy would spare you. The army surgeon, when illness comes, opens a chest that looks reassuringly full. Lancets, a bleeding bowl, calomel, herbs, neat rows of labelled jars, and discovers, as every physician in this story already has, that his tools are built for humours and imbalance, not for a fever with no interest in being bled or purged into submission. He can set a broken arm with real skill. Against camp fever he can mostly just sit with a man, which quietly is not nothing, though it never feels like enough at 3 a.m. Consider too the particular recruit who grew up on a thinly settled farm, miles from the nearest neighbour who never once in childhood caught measles or smallpox because there was simply never anyone nearby to catch it from. He arrives at camp healthy, strong, glad of the company after a lonely upbringing, and meets both diseases for the first time in his life within his first month under canvas, at an age when a child's body would have shrugged off the fever in a week, and a grown man's body sometimes cannot. It is one of the quieter cruelties of camp life that isolation, which kept a boy safe on the farm, turns out to be the very thing that leaves him defenceless the moment he finally meets a crowd. Historians still argue whether it was dysentery, smallpox, or the typhus fevers that did the most killing in any given camp, since the surgeon's own tallies rarely agreed with one another and rarely agreed, either with what the chaplains were quietly writing in the burial book. This is the camp Washington's men are living in when the 1777 inoculation order finally reaches them, the one you heard about a few sections back as a piece of policy, a decision made far away with ink and a desk. From inside the camp it looks nothing like policy. It looks like a line of recruits, some of them the very boys whose flints you were just watching on the green, waiting their turn at a house set apart for the purpose, choosing to be made deliberately sick with a mild managed dose of the very disease that has already emptied so many other camps around them, on the calculated bet that a few bad weeks now beat a raging epidemic later. It is, in its own grim arithmetic, the smartest thing anyone in this war does with a blade that isn't attached to a musket, and it works far better than the lancets and bleeding bowls ever managed to. Somewhere in every camp too sits a quirky, stubborn little fact. Soldiers guarded their salt more jealously than their gunpowder, because a man could march without firing a shot but not without salting the meat that kept him standing. And a quartermaster who ran short of it had a mutiny brewing faster than any general ever caused one on purpose. The Musterfield boys do not know any of this yet, and you do not tell them, because there is a kindness in letting a person walk toward a hard season, one unhurried step at a time rather than all at once. So the morning stays simple a little longer, flints checked, powder horns tapped for damp, canteens filled at a well that is for now still clean. Somewhere beyond the Musterfield and beyond this particular spring, another camp is already stirring at first light, cook fires being coaxed back. From ash, men rising stiff from the cold ground under blankets they share with men they did not know a year ago. The mist still lying low over the huts and the picket line, and the whole quiet, crowded machinery of the day beginning again. And in that quiet, past the tents, there is almost always a low mound of turned earth near the tree line, because an army buries as it marches, without ceremony to spare. But go home, out of camp, back to the dooryard and the meeting house, and burying becomes something else entirely, something your neighbours have practised so often that they are, frankly, better at it than at almost anything else. You walk into a burying ground on any ordinary Sunday, and you can read the whole history of how a people felt about dying. carved right into the stone. The oldest markers, the ones leaning hardest, were a winged skull glaring out from the top of the slate, a death's head with hollow round eyes and a stone grin, wings spread wide as if leaving in a hurry. It sits there because a Puritan grandfather wanted the living reminded plainly that they were going to die too, and that vanity was foolish given the facts. Wait a generation, though, and the same stonecutters, sometimes the very same family of them, start rounding those hollow eyes, softening the brow, until the death's head has become something closer to a cherub, a round-cheeked little face with the same wings, but no longer grinning, more like it is watching over you than warning you. Wait another generation and the cherub is gone too, replaced by an urn draped in a willow tree, weeping gently over an inscription instead of threatening one. Nobody wrote a proclamation announcing this. Nobody voted on it at a town meeting. It happened slate by slate, one carver's hand influencing the next, and by the time it was finished, an entire way of thinking had shifted. From a religion that wanted you frightened into virtue, to one willing, at last, to let grief simply be sad instead of also being a warning. You have that slate, and only that slate, to thank for being able to read any of this so many decades later. New Englanders were sitting on some of the finest gravestone rock on the continent, quarried up in Massachusetts and Connecticut, dense and fine-grained and nearly waterproof, and it takes a chisel mark and holds it for centuries the way a soft summer cheese does not. Families who could afford marble instead got something whiter and grander on the day it went up, and something 100 winters of frost and rain will rub as smooth and blank as a bar of soap. Your slate death's head, plain grey slab that it is still glaring at strangers in the century you're listening from. The marble angel, gone soft and featureless, is not glaring at anyone. Funerals themselves, before you ever reach the stone, are their own long ceremony of small kindnesses. When someone in your household dies, the neighbour women come, the way they came for a birth, and they wash the body and wrap it in a winding sheet, plain linen, sewn or pinned closed, because linen is what is on hand and what everyone already understands. Someone sits up through the night with the body, a candle burning low, because a person should not lie alone even after they have stopped needing the company, and the custom is as much for the sitters as the departed, giving grief somewhere to be at 2 a.m. besides your own chest. There will be a sermon, delivered by your minister, often printed afterward as a small pamphlet so that families who could not fit inside the meeting house might still own a copy, along with an elegy, a poem composed for the occasion, sometimes moving, and sometimes, it must be said, composed by someone with rather more enthusiasm than talent for rhyme. Funeral sermons here have a reputation, gently earned, for running very long, long enough that a bench grows harder under a mourner by the hour and grief has its patience, but a wooden pew has rather less. And then there are the gifts. At a proper funeral, mourners receive things to remember the dead by, and to remember too whose family paid for such a fine burying. Mourning rings, small and engraved, sometimes with a lock of the departed's hair sealed under glass and mourning gloves pair after pair, handed to everyone who attends, ministers included, sometimes dozens of pairs at a single funeral. Over the decades it became a contest of grief displayed for the neighbours, families spending themselves toward ruin trying to out-mourn one another in rings and gloves and black cloth, until the Massachusetts legislature stepped in 1721 and again in 1741, and passed laws limiting how extravagant a funeral was allowed to be, which is a strange thing to legislate, government reaching all the way into a widow's grief to specify exactly how many gloves is too many gloves. Historians still argue whether these sumptuary laws were mostly about frugality, keeping struggling families from bankrupting themselves over a burial, or mostly about keeping the wealthy from flaunting their wealth even in death. And probably it was some uneasy mixture of both, the way most laws about money and pride tend to be. Walk further into the burying ground and you find the part that slows every visitor down. A row of small stones, child-sized, 4 or 5 together bearing the same family name and years only a few winters apart, sometimes carved by a hand more used to grown men's epitaphs than a child's, the spelling wandering a little sideways on a word like beloved, proof that colonial stonecutters were marvellous with a chisel and only sometimes reliable with a dictionary. This was not a family that had 6 children and buried 5 without noticing. This was a family that grieved each one in turn, fully, with a sermon and a sheet and a stone before turning back to the children who remained. What you're standing in, walking this ground at dusk with the light going soft and orange between the leaning slates, is not a culture numbed to death by overexposure. It is the opposite, a culture fluent in grief, the way you might be fluent in a language practiced constantly from childhood, with words ready for the sermon, gestures ready for the sitting up, garments ready for the mourning, and a whole grammar of stone ready for the carver, so that when death arrived, as it always did, nobody stood there wondering what to say or do. The stone nearest your foot gives an age of 2, and the one beside it gives 11 months, and you find yourself doing the sum that everyone who has ever walked slowly through an old burying ground eventually does, without quite meaning to. You start averaging the ages carved into the rows around you, and the number that comes out is small and low and unkind, and it is also, in a way you're about to discover, almost entirely beside the point. Here is the trick laid out plainly because it is worth carrying home with you tonight. A number called life expectancy at birth is not a guess about how long any one particular person will live. It is an arithmetic mean, and an arithmetic mean is a strange wobbly sort of creature. Nobody has ever once been embarrassed by how easily it can be dragged around, by a small handful of very small numbers standing near it. Picture 10 people in a row, half asleep is fine, you do not need to see their faces. 9 of them live to be 70, and 1 of them sadly dies within the year. Add the ages together, divide by 10, and the average lifespan of that little row comes out at 63. Not because any single person in it lived to 63, not one, but because a single small number at one end can pull an entire average down by decades. Now, instead of 1 loss in 10, imagine something closer to what the Chesapeake actually recorded, roughly a quarter of children never reaching their first birthday, and another quarter never reaching their 20s. 2 heavy clusters sitting at the front of the row, quietly doing their arithmetic on everyone else's number. That is most of your famous figure right there. Not grown men keeling over in the tobacco rows at 38, babies and toddlers and children with a fever, sitting at the start of the column pulling the whole sum downward. Historians still argue whether even that infant figure is the true one, or an undercount since a baby who died before it could be baptised often went unrecorded in the parish register altogether. No line in the book, no name entered, and so, on paper, no death at all, which would mean the smallest end of the average carried a weight heavier than anything the surviving records can show you. But look now at the other half of the row, the half the average quietly erases from the picture. A white man in the 17th century Chesapeake who reached his 20th birthday, who had already outlasted the cradle, the seasoning fever and the crossing itself, could reasonably expect to see his 40s, and often a good deal further. Up in New England, where the water ran cleaner and the mosquito season was shorter, and families arrived whole instead of scattered, someone who survived childhood could often expect something closer to 70, a number that would sit comfortably on a chart drawn today. 2 names you already know sit at the far end of that same table. Benjamin Franklin, printer, diplomat, collector of ideas and admirer of his own wit, died at 84. John Adams, cranky and outspoken to the very last, made it all the way to 90, and by coincidence nobody could have planned, died on the 4th of July. Those are not statistical flukes standing apart from the pattern. They are what surviving childhood actually purchased for you, if you were fortunate enough and privileged enough to get that far. So here is the sentence worth turning over slowly, one more time before the light goes. Most people never reach 40 is a true statement about a statistic, and a badly misleading statement about a population. It describes an average with 2 heavy stones tied around its ankles, nothing more sinister than that. Statisticians have spent 2 centuries trying to explain this politely to a public that only ever wanted one tidy number to repeat at dinner, and mostly the public just remembers the number, and forgets the patient explanation, which is either the saddest thing about the profession, or the funniest, depending entirely on the hour of the night you ask. And nobody, if it comes to that, ever actually expected to live to their life expectancy. That was rather the whole point of the phrase, and rather its quiet joke, if a phrase like life expectancy can be said to have a sense of humour about itself, which on the whole, it really cannot. The colonial world you have been walking through all this evening was not, in fact, a world of 39-year-olds clutching their chests in every doorway. It was a world with a great many grandmothers in it, spinning by the window in failing light, a great many grandfathers by the fire with their pipes and their long unasked-for opinions on the weather, a great many old men on meeting-house steps telling stories nobody had quite requested, and it was at the very same time a world with an enormous number of graveyards, where the smallest stones, the ones cut for the shortest sentences, room enough for a name and a season and little else, outnumbered every other stone around them, sometimes 2 and 3 to 1. And here, gently, is the part worth sitting with as the last of the light goes, the real difference between that world And the one you woke up in this morning was never chiefly that grown adults learned some clever new trick for lasting longer, though medicine did help, eventually later elsewhere in its slow and stumbling way. The real difference is quieter than that, and sadder to look at directly, and in the end kinder to carry with you. Children, by and large, simply stopped dying. That is the whole hinge the number turns on, not longer old age waiting at the far end of life. Fewer small stones waiting near the beginning of it. You turn that thought over once more in your open hand, the grandmother's, and the graveyards both true at the very same time, both sitting quietly together in your palm, the weight of it shifting slightly depending on which side happens to be facing up. And what you find, turning it over, is that it was never a verdict on you, only an average worn low by its smallest and saddest members. And once you understand that, you can set it down. So let the whole journey come back to you now, slowly, the way a hand moves along a stone wall in the dark, touching each rough place without needing to stop. The key again, first, damp planks under new shoes, a chest at your feet, a ticket folded soft with handling. The crossing, 5 feet of headroom, 8 long weeks of green water in the cask, and the ship easing at last up a wide brown river in the heat of August. The seasoning summer, the fever that comes in the 3rd week, a word so gentle for what it meant, and the barrel of water you looked at differently afterward. The birthing room, shuttered and warm, the caudle passed hand to hand, and somewhere in Hallowell a midwife named Martha, writing a name into a diary that would run to nearly 10,000 entries, before she finally set the pen down. The cradle by the hearth, firelight moving softly over a small sleeping face. The schoolhouse benches, some of them empty by autumn, the throat distemper having come and gone through a town too small to hide from it. The fire banked low each night, coals drawing in on themselves under ash, one small, kept ember standing in for the whole idea of safety. The cellar of barrels, cider and small beer, breathing quietly in the cold dark, keeping you alive for reasons nobody down there could have named. The marsh at dusk, the wine beginning, a fever that would come every other day like something you could set a clock by. The bleeding bowl and the lancet, a doctor's bag closing on remedies that as often hurt as helped, offered always by hands that were only trying. The stillroom shelf at dusk, jars of dried herb and bark, a home remedy copied out of a well-worn little book. Boston, counting itself in December of 1721, the sick tallied, the dead tallied, and a scar on the arm of a man named Onesimus, carrying an idea all the way from West Africa that would go on saving lives it was never properly thanked for saving. Philadelphia's first frost in 1793. Cold finally doing what medicine could not. The fever loosening its grip on a capital that had spent a whole autumn afraid. A ledger closing on numbers that never quite counted everyone. Servants and the enslaved pressed into columns that told less than the whole truth. An old man on a meeting-house step in New England, 70 years old and entirely unremarkable there. Proof that the same century could be kinder in different soil. A camp at dawn, quiet at last, more men lost there to bad water than to any battle. And the burying ground at dusk, small stones standing among the larger ones, death's heads softening over the generations into cherubs and then into willows and urns. A whole culture teaching itself gentler ways to grieve. That is the road you have walked tonight. And here is the truth waiting at the end of it. None of these people thought of themselves as doomed. They were not lying awake, counting their probable expiration date like some nervous little actuary. They were mostly just getting on with supper. They buried children in the spring and planted orchards in the very same season, trusting fruit they might never live to taste. They argued, loudly and for decades, about whether inoculation was salvation or poison, and kept arguing even while it went on quietly saving them. They wrote down 10,000 diary entries about births and deaths and the weather, because writing a thing down is its own small act of faith in tomorrow. They kept going, is the short version of it, generation after generation, not because the odds were good, but because getting up in the morning has never once required good odds. And you, lying wherever you are lying now, warm, fed, protected against half of what once filled those graveyards, drinking water that will not harm you, are the far end of every one of those small decisions to keep going. No one is going to throw a lit grenade through your window tonight over a disagreement about medicine. The worst you are likely to face before morning is a slightly cold pillow. That ordinary safety, the kind you almost never pause to notice, is the whole, quiet inheritance. You do not have to earn it tonight. You only have to lie inside it and let it hold you. So notice it now, just for a moment before you let it go. Notice the warmth around you. Notice the quiet. Notice that the dark tonight is not something to fight, only something to rest inside. Somewhere, far back along the road you just walked, a fire is being banked for the night. Hands move slow over the coals. Ash sifts down, soft as breath. The flames draw inward, small and orange and safe, and the room around them goes dim and warm and still. The house settles. A door is latched. A cat curls closer to the hearth. Outside, the cold waits, but it cannot get in. You do not have to keep watch tonight. You do not have to count anything, or argue with anyone, or wonder what a fever means. You only have to lie here, warm, and let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders soften into the mattress. Let your hands go loose. Let your eyes rest now, heavy, easy. The candle is low. The house is quiet. The fire is banked and it will hold until morning. The way it always has, the way it always will. You're safe here. You are warm here. There is nowhere else. You need to be. Let the story go now. Let the numbers go. Let the whole long journey settle behind you like a coat. Set down by the door. You made it all the way to tonight. That is enough. Just rest. Just breathe. Just sleep.